Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In April 2000, the small town of Richmond, located in the heart of Virginia, was shaken by a brutal and highly publicized murder that would captivate the nation. The victim, Charlie Reynolds, was a 35-year-old respected businessman and well-known philanthropist in the community. A father of 2 young children, Charlie had always been viewed as an upstanding individual with a promising future ahead of him. His untimely death, however, was not a random act of violence. It was the result of a carefully calculated plan set in motion by someone who had been lurking in the shadows of his life for much longer than anyone could have anticipated. The morning of April 15th began like any other in Richmond. The sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light over the city streets as commuters made their way to work. Charlie had been preparing for a routine business meeting that would take place later that afternoon at his downtown office. He had been in the midst of expanding his family's construction business and had recently secured a large contract that could take his company to the next level. Despite the pressure of his professional commitments, Charlie had always been able to balance his work and personal life, often volunteering for local charities and spending time with his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 children, Lucas and Emily. At around 9 a.m., Charlie was found dead in the parking lot behind his office building. The body was discovered by a passerby who initially mistook it for an unfortunate accident. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that Charlie had been murdered. He had been shot multiple times at close range. The gunshots had been quick and precise, suggesting that the killer had known exactly what they were doing. The scene was eerily quiet, and no one had witnessed the crime or heard the gunfire, despite the proximity to the busy streets of downtown Richmond. The police were called to the scene immediately, and Detective Laura Barnes, an experienced investigator with the Richmond Police Department, was assigned to lead the case. As soon as she arrived at the scene, she was struck by the lack of evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, and the body appeared to have been carefully positioned in the parking lot, as if the killer had been deliberate in their actions. It was clear that this was not a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was a cold-blooded execution. As the initial investigation unfolded, Detective Barnes quickly learned that Charlie Reynolds was no stranger to controversy. While he had built a reputation as a successful businessman and philanthropist, there were whispers in the community about a darker side to his personal life. Several individuals came forward with information about Charlie's past relationships, and it soon became apparent that Charlie had been involved in a complex web of personal and professional entanglements. His success had earned him many allies, but it had also made him enemies, some of whom were now under suspicion. One of the first leads came from Charlie's former business partner, William "Billy" Bradford. Billy had worked with Charlie for over a decade, helping to establish their construction business into one of the most successful companies in the region. However, their partnership had ended acrimoniously several years before Charlie's death. According to sources close to the investigation, Billy had been bitter about the breakup, feeling that Charlie had taken the majority of the credit for their shared success. Some even speculated that Billy had felt betrayed by Charlie's decision to cut him out of the business when it expanded. Billy's bitterness had been well known to those who worked with him, and many believed that his resentment toward Charlie had only deepened over the years. Detective Barnes and her team began to look into Billy Bradford's whereabouts on the day of the murder. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed Billy's car parked in the vicinity of Charlie's office building around the time of the murder. When questioned, Billy claimed that he had been at a meeting with a potential new business partner and had not been near the parking lot. However, his alibi was weak at best. Upon further scrutiny, Detective Barnes discovered that Billy had a criminal record related to financial fraud and had previously been involved in several shady business dealings. This discovery only deepened suspicions about his possible involvement in the murder. As the investigation progressed, a breakthrough came when the forensics team discovered a partial fingerprint on the door handle of Charlie's office building. The print, while not enough to conclusively identify the perpetrator, was a crucial piece of evidence. With the help of a fingerprint analysis expert, they were able to determine that the print matched a man named James "Jimmy" Walker, a local criminal with a history of violence and ties to the underground world of organized crime. Walker had been arrested multiple times for assault, robbery, and drug-related offenses, but had managed to avoid any significant prison time. James Walker's connection to Charlie Reynolds was initially unclear, but Detective Barnes soon uncovered that Walker had been employed by Charlie's company as a subcontractor on several construction projects. Despite his criminal background, Walker had been able to maintain a low profile, working in the shadows and keeping a distance from the public eye. However, it appeared that his relationship with Charlie had soured over time. Witnesses came forward to report that Walker had been unhappy with the way Charlie had treated him during their business dealings, claiming that he had been underpaid and mistreated on multiple occasions. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, it became clear that Walker may have been motivated by a combination of personal animosity and financial gain. Billy Bradford, already a prime suspect in the case, had connections to Walker through their shared involvement in the criminal underworld. It seemed that both men had been quietly working behind the scenes to sabotage Charlie's business ventures, hoping to reap the rewards of his downfall. The possibility of a conspiracy began to emerge, with two men, one with a deep personal vendetta and the other with a history of violent tendencies, joining forces to take down a man they both resented. The next step in the investigation was to trace Walker's movements in the days leading up to the murder. Surveillance footage revealed that Walker had visited Charlie's office building several times, sometimes late at night or in the early hours of the morning, when no one else was around. It appeared that Walker had been staking out the building, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Detective Barnes also discovered that Walker had been in contact with Billy Bradford in the days before Charlie's murder, further suggesting that the two men had been planning the killing together. With this new evidence, Detective Barnes was able to build a case that pointed squarely at James Walker and Billy Bradford as the masterminds behind Charlie Reynolds' murder. They had carefully orchestrated the crime, with Billy providing the motive and Walker carrying out the brutal act. Their plan had been cold and calculated, and it appeared they had hoped that the murder would be deemed the result of a business dispute gone wrong. The investigation was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place. Detective Barnes knew that the next step would be to gather enough evidence to arrest both men. However, as she prepared to make her move, she also understood that this case would be one that would stay with her forever. The murder of Charlie Reynolds had been shocking, not just because of the brutality of the act, but because of the way in which two men, once tied to him through business and personal dealings, had turned on him so violently. The next chapter of the investigation would involve piecing together the full extent of the conspiracy. But for now, Detective Barnes had one goal: to ensure that justice was served for Charlie Reynolds and his family, whose lives had been forever changed by the greed and resentment of two men who had been willing to destroy everything for the sake of revenge. Detective Barnes had a sense of urgency, knowing that the deeper she delved into this case, the more complex it became. The investigation into Charlie Reynolds' murder was no longer just about finding a killer. It had grown into a web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden motives. As she pieced together the fragmented evidence, she began to uncover a tangled network of relationships, past grievances, and financial struggles that had led to Charlie's death. The discovery of James Walker's fingerprints on the door handle of Charlie's office building had been a crucial breakthrough, but it wasn't enough on its own. Barnes knew that Walker's background, a mix of violent offenses and criminal associations, made him a prime suspect. Yet, she couldn't dismiss the possibility that someone else might have been involved. The connection between Walker and Billy Bradford was clear, but there were still lingering questions about the extent of their involvement in Charlie's murder. Had they acted alone, or was there a larger conspiracy at play? Barnes decided to dig deeper into Walker's history, hoping to uncover more details about his interactions with Charlie and whether there were any additional motives at play. It became evident that Walker's criminal past was far from behind him. Despite his earlier attempts to maintain a low profile, his name had come up in connection with several shady business dealings, particularly in the construction industry. Walker had reportedly been dissatisfied with his position in Charlie's company, feeling that his work was undervalued and that he was being exploited by Charlie's success. The resentment had been brewing for some time, and Detective Barnes believed that it had reached a boiling point. There were whispers from some of Charlie's former employees who had been hesitant to come forward, fearing retribution. Some spoke of Walker's erratic behavior during his time with the company, suggesting that he had been prone to angry outbursts and had a tendency to lash out when things didn't go his way. There were accounts of him being involved in heated arguments with Charlie over contracts, wages, and the treatment of subcontractors. Some workers had even reported feeling intimidated by Walker, especially when he became frustrated over what he perceived as unfair treatment. Yet, despite this evidence of a strained relationship between Walker and Charlie, Barnes could not help but wonder about Billy Bradford's role in all of this. Billy had been Charlie's business partner for over a decade, and their partnership had been integral to the company's rise to prominence. But after their split, things had soured quickly. Billy had harbored a deep resentment toward Charlie for years, and it seemed that the animosity had only grown stronger over time. The breakup of their partnership was reportedly messy, with Charlie taking full control of the company's assets and leaving Billy with nothing but bitterness. In the weeks leading up to the murder, there had been signs that Billy was growing more desperate. Sources close to the investigation revealed that Billy had been involved in a series of failed business ventures and had been struggling financially. He had tried unsuccessfully to restart his own construction company, but the market had become increasingly competitive, and Billy's reputation had taken a hit due to his contentious split with Charlie. While Charlie's company continued to thrive, Billy's had languished, and the financial strain had taken its toll on his personal life. It was no secret that Billy had fallen into debt, and it was rumored that he had turned to illegal methods to stay afloat, including ties to organized crime in Richmond. The more Barnes uncovered, the more she believed that Billy and Walker had been in cahoots for much longer than anyone realized. There were reports of meetings between the two men in the weeks before Charlie's death, meetings that had been held in secret, away from prying eyes. Barnes managed to track down several individuals who had witnessed these encounters, and the details they provided painted a disturbing picture of a conspiracy that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. The motive was beginning to take shape. Billy's resentment toward Charlie had festered for years, and his financial instability had only worsened after their separation. Billy was desperate, and the possibility of revenge against Charlie must have seemed like the only way to get back at him, both personally and professionally. By joining forces with Walker, a man who had his own reasons for hating Charlie, Billy had found a way to exact his revenge and rid himself of a thorn in his side. But as the pieces began to fall into place, Barnes realized that there was still much work to be done. Walker had been known to keep a low profile, avoiding attention, and his connections to the criminal world made it difficult to track him down. Barnes knew that she would need more than just eyewitness testimony to make a solid case against him and Billy. Surveillance footage, phone records, and financial documents were all essential to building a comprehensive timeline of events leading up to the murder. With this in mind, Barnes and her team spent days reviewing hours of surveillance footage from the area surrounding Charlie's office building. They discovered that Walker had been in the vicinity at least 3 times in the days before the murder, each time under the cover of darkness. On the night before Charlie was killed, Walker was seen on a nearby security camera entering the alley behind the office building, his face obscured by a hooded jacket. He lingered near the entrance for several minutes before disappearing into the shadows, just as the building's security system recorded an unfamiliar car pulling into the lot. Barnes couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as she watched the footage. Everything was falling into place, and she was certain that they were closing in on the truth. Additionally, phone records obtained from both Billy and Walker revealed a series of calls and text messages exchanged between the two men in the hours leading up to the murder. These communications, though seemingly innocent at first glance, revealed a more sinister undertone. They discussed their plans in coded language, using phrases that suggested they were orchestrating the murder. It became clear that Billy and Walker had meticulously planned every detail, from the timing of the killing to the method by which they would execute it. Detective Barnes knew that she was now on the verge of making an arrest, but she also understood that she had to be cautious. If she moved too quickly, she risked alerting Billy and Walker, giving them the chance to flee or destroy evidence. She worked tirelessly, consulting with forensic experts, gathering witness testimony, and compiling all the evidence necessary to build a watertight case. As the investigation reached its critical point, Barnes found herself reflecting on the nature of the crime. Charlie Reynolds had been a man who had built a life of success and respect. He had a loving family, a thriving business, and a reputation as a generous philanthropist. Yet, all of that had been shattered in an instant by 2 men who had been consumed by jealousy, greed, and revenge. For Barnes, the case was a harsh reminder of how the pursuit of power and the scars of betrayal could drive even the most seemingly ordinary people to commit horrific acts. It was a sobering realization, one that reinforced her resolve to see justice done for Charlie, his family, and the community that had been forever impacted by the events of that fateful day. Detective Barnes was fully immersed in the case now, the pieces falling into place as she followed every lead with precision. Every new piece of information revealed another layer to the dark and twisted story of Charlie Reynolds' murder. Her investigative instincts had taken her through countless hours of digging into both Billy Bradford and James Walker's pasts. They were not just suspects. They were men who had spent years cultivating resentment, anger, and financial desperation that would eventually lead to the tragic end of an innocent man's life. As Barnes continued to analyze the evidence, she grew increasingly convinced that the crime was not simply a case of one individual snapping. The calculated nature of Charlie's murder, the careful planning involved, and the apparent attempt to cover their tracks suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond what she had initially anticipated. Both Billy and Walker had had ample time to act, but they had chosen the day of Charlie's scheduled business meeting, a time when the offices were quiet and the area around Charlie's workplace would be less crowded. The murder was meant to be swift, without witnesses, and it seemed that the plan was executed with a chilling level of precision. Barnes had now identified a critical factor: Billy Bradford's need for money. It was clear that he had turned to increasingly desperate measures to get back on top. The construction industry had been kind to him once, but after his fallout with Charlie, he had seen nothing but failure. He had invested money into risky ventures, hoping to make a profit, but his plans had backfired. The financial strain had pushed him further into debt. One person who had been willing to talk on the record, a former associate of Billy's from the construction world, revealed that Billy had been on the edge for months, speaking to anyone who would listen about taking revenge on Charlie for what he had done to him. It was this bitterness that had fueled the murder, but Barnes knew it wasn't the full story. James Walker, too, had a deep resentment that had been building for years. He had worked for Charlie's company as a subcontractor, his position as a construction laborer putting him in close contact with Charlie, but never quite on the same level. Walker had always felt like he was on the periphery, looking in at Charlie's success and his ability to command respect in the industry. According to multiple sources, Walker had been vocal about his feelings of being underappreciated and treated unfairly, both by Charlie and by others in the company. It was this simmering frustration that had given way to violence. But Barnes had more to uncover. There was a strange feeling that something bigger was at play, as if the murder wasn't merely the result of personal vendettas and broken friendships. The timing of the killing, the day of Charlie's important business meeting, suggested that there had been a deeper understanding between Billy and Walker, and that they had both been aware of just how critical this particular moment in Charlie's life was. In addition, Barnes started to suspect that someone had been assisting them from the shadows. It was almost as though there had been an orchestrated effort behind the scenes, not just from two disgruntled men, but possibly from others in their circle. Could it be that someone had been financing or enabling them? Someone who stood to gain something from Charlie's downfall? The breakthrough came when Barnes focused on the financial records. The more she analyzed Billy and Walker's past transactions, the clearer it became that there had been money moving between their accounts in the months leading up to the murder. Billy had transferred a significant sum to Walker, an amount that seemed unusual given their strained relationship. The transfer was not noted as a loan or repayment for services rendered. It was simply listed as payment for services. There was a vague description attached, but it was too vague for Barnes to ignore. It was clear that this was no ordinary business transaction. Barnes knew that she had to dig into the origins of this payment. She worked with forensic accountants and soon discovered that this particular transaction had been the result of a private loan from a third party. The lender was anonymous, but the amount transferred was substantial, far more than Billy had the means to repay at that time. This discovery shifted the investigation in an entirely new direction. It was possible that there was a financial backer involved, someone who had been pulling strings from the shadows to ensure that Charlie Reynolds' empire would collapse. As the investigation continued, Barnes and her team worked tirelessly to trace the origins of this loan. They quickly narrowed it down to a small group of wealthy investors in the area who had been involved in the construction business, but had been frustrated with Charlie's monopolistic hold on the industry. These individuals were known for their ruthless tactics, and it seemed increasingly likely that they had been using Billy and Walker as pawns in a larger scheme to eliminate Charlie, thus opening up opportunities for themselves. The deeper Barnes dug, the more she realized how deeply Charlie Reynolds' success had unsettled people in the industry. He had made a name for himself through hard work and fair deals, but his growing influence had threatened the status quo. As his business expanded, he had inadvertently made enemies in the world of construction and finance. Some of these people had begun to view Charlie as a threat to their own livelihoods, believing that if Charlie continued to rise, they would be left behind. It was these individuals who had quietly supported Billy and Walker, giving them the financial resources they needed to carry out the murder. Despite this revelation, the investigation was still not complete. Barnes knew that even with this new information, she still needed concrete evidence to prove the conspiracy. She had the financial transactions, the testimony from various associates, and even the corroborating witness reports, but there was still the question of how to connect all of these pieces into a single, irrefutable narrative. As she moved forward, she decided to focus on one key aspect: the timeline. On the night before Charlie's murder, Barnes took a close look at the security footage again, this time examining every moment with a fine-tooth comb. She noted that Walker had been parked outside the office building at precisely the time Charlie had been leaving a dinner meeting with potential investors. This would have given Walker an opportunity to track Charlie's movements without arousing suspicion. The footage also showed Billy's car in the vicinity, a few blocks away from the office, at around the same time. This was not just coincidence. This was evidence that Billy and Walker had been shadowing Charlie, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By piecing together phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements, Barnes was able to reconstruct the final moments of Charlie's life. It was clear now that Billy and Walker had been working in tandem, each playing a critical role in the murder. Billy had been the mastermind, while Walker had executed the crime with precision. But there was more to uncover about the network of financial backers, and it would take time to bring them all to justice. As Barnes prepared for the arrests, she couldn't shake the feeling that the murder of Charlie Reynolds had been the result of a convergence of greed, resentment, and fear. It was a stark reminder of how the desire for power could push people to the brink, turning former allies into enemies. But it was also a story about the lengths to which people would go to protect their interests, even if it meant destroying the life of an innocent man. The investigation was far from over, and Barnes knew that the full scope of the conspiracy would take time to unravel, but she was determined to see justice served. Detective Barnes had reached a critical point in her investigation, with enough evidence to make an arrest, but a lingering sense that there was still more to uncover. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the story behind Charlie Reynolds' murder was more than just the actions of two disgruntled men driven by jealousy and financial hardship. There were still questions about who was pulling the strings, and Barnes knew that there was a larger network involved. Her team had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to implicate both Billy Bradford and James Walker in the crime. Surveillance footage placed them both near the crime scene at key times. Phone records tied them together in ways that couldn't be explained away, and witness statements confirmed their presence in the area. Billy's financial troubles and Walker's resentment toward Charlie painted a clear motive for the murder. But what still eluded Barnes was the question of why they had taken such extreme measures to eliminate Charlie. Were they acting solely out of their own greed and anger, or was there something deeper at play? The final breakthrough came when Barnes and her team were able to track down the mysterious backer who had provided the financial support for Billy and Walker. It turned out that the money Billy had transferred to Walker had come from an anonymous source, someone with deep ties to the construction industry. After digging deeper into this financial trail, Barnes discovered that the source of the money was a group of wealthy investors who had long seen Charlie Reynolds as a threat. These individuals were not just interested in making money. They were driven by a desire to dismantle Charlie's empire and take control of the lucrative contracts he had secured over the years. As Barnes delved into the financial history of these investors, she uncovered a complex web of connections and dealings. These men had been operating behind the scenes for years, funding various schemes to undermine Charlie's business. They had attempted to sabotage his deals, spread rumors about him in the industry, and even tried to buy out his company on several occasions. But Charlie had managed to thwart their efforts, which only made them more desperate. In the end, they had decided that the only way to bring Charlie down was through violence. The investors had enlisted Billy and Walker to carry out their plans, offering them money and resources to make sure the job was done right. Billy, whose bitterness toward Charlie had been building for years, had jumped at the opportunity to exact revenge. Walker, whose anger had festered over his years of working for Charlie, saw this as his chance to finally get rid of the man he blamed for his failures. Together, they had meticulously planned the murder, timing it to coincide with Charlie's scheduled meeting with potential investors. a meeting that was meant to solidify Charlie's position as one of the most influential figures in the construction industry. Barnes could now see how the pieces fit together. Billy and Walker had been pawns in a larger scheme, manipulated by powerful men who had the resources to orchestrate a murder and cover their tracks. They had taken advantage of Billy's desperation and Walker's rage, using them as tools to eliminate Charlie and take over his business empire. But even as Barnes uncovered more about the investors' involvement, she realized that this case was far from over. The arrest of Billy and Walker was only the beginning. As she prepared to bring them in for questioning, Barnes knew that she needed to take down the individuals who had orchestrated the murder from the shadows. The wealthy investors who had funded the plot needed to be held accountable for their role in Charlie's death, and Barnes was determined to make sure they faced justice. It wouldn't be easy. These men were powerful, and they had the means to fight back, but Barnes was resolute. She knew that the key to taking them down lay in the financial records, the phone calls, and the witness testimony that had already painted a damning picture of their involvement. In the days following Billy and Walker's arrest, Barnes and her team continued to press forward. They conducted a series of interviews with those close to the investors, hoping to gather more information about their role in the conspiracy. Slowly but surely, the investigation began to unravel the full extent of the plot. The network of individuals who had been involved in the planning and execution of the murder was vast, stretching across multiple industries and regions. Barnes learned that these investors had been working together for years, using their wealth and influence to manipulate the construction industry for their own gain. As the investigation progressed, Barnes was faced with a moral dilemma. She had seen firsthand how greed and ambition could drive people to commit unspeakable acts, and she was determined to ensure that those responsible for Charlie's murder would not escape justice. But as she uncovered more about the investors' reach and their connections to other powerful figures, she began to understand the full scope of the corruption that had allowed this crime to take place. The web of deceit and manipulation ran deep, and Barnes knew that bringing these individuals to justice would require more than just evidence. It would require courage and determination. In the end, the case of Charlie Reynolds' murder was not just about the loss of one life, but about the larger forces at play in an industry driven by greed, power, and betrayal. It was a story of how ambition could cloud judgment, how personal vendettas could be used to manipulate others, and how a network of wealthy individuals could use their influence to take down those they saw as obstacles to their success. But it was also a story of resilience, the resilience of those who refused to turn a blind eye to injustice, and the determination of those who fought to expose the truth. Barnes knew that the fight was far from over. The conspiracy behind Charlie's murder was vast, and there were still many people who had yet to be held accountable for their actions. But she also knew that, with each step she took, she was getting closer to uncovering the full truth. And in the end, that was all that mattered: justice for Charlie, justice for his family, and justice for the victims of those who thought they could hide behind their wealth and power. As Barnes stood in front of the courthouse, ready to present her findings, she felt a sense of resolve. She had seen the dark side of human nature, but she had also seen the strength of those who fought to make things right. Charlie Reynolds may have been gone, but his story would not be forgotten. It would serve as a reminder that even in a world where money and power often ruled, the truth had a way of coming to light. And as long as there were those willing to fight for it, justice would always find a way to prevail. Story 2. In April 2000, the city of Seattle was rocked by the brutal and senseless murder of 23-year-old university student Heather McDonald. Heather had been a promising young woman with a bright future ahead of her. She had recently graduated with honors from the University of Washington, where she majored in psychology and was preparing to begin a career in counseling. Heather's life was taken violently, leaving her family and friends in shock and disbelief. The case began when Heather's body was discovered late one evening by a passerby along a quiet stretch of the Burke-Gilman Trail, an area frequented by joggers and cyclists. The discovery was gruesome. Her body had been left in a wooded area just off the path, hidden by overgrown brush and debris. Heather had been strangled, and her belongings were scattered around her, suggesting a violent struggle had occurred before her death. The scene was chilling, and the police quickly determined that this was not a case of a random accident or a simple robbery gone wrong. The brutal nature of the crime indicated something far more sinister. Detective Karen Montgomery, a seasoned investigator with the Seattle Police Department, was assigned to the case. She had seen her fair share of murders, but there was something particularly unsettling about Heather's death. The victim's life had seemed so full of promise, and now she was gone. The first step was to gather information about Heather's life, who she had been, who her friends were, and what circumstances could have led to her untimely death. Montgomery began by interviewing Heather's roommates. They described her as a kind and generous person, someone who was deeply committed to her studies and to helping others. Heather had been an active member of the university's counseling group, and she had even volunteered at a local community center, helping at-risk youth. Everyone who knew her spoke of her positive attitude and strong work ethic, making her death all the more difficult to understand. There were no indications that Heather had any enemies, and no one seemed to have any clue why anyone would want to harm her. The investigation soon turned to Heather's relationships, both personal and professional. Montgomery learned that Heather had recently broken off a brief but intense relationship with a man named Paul Jackson. Paul was a fellow student at the university, and though the relationship had only lasted a few months, it had been turbulent. Several of Heather's friends described Paul as possessive and controlling, but Heather had never mentioned any serious problems during their time together. Still, Montgomery couldn't ignore the possibility that Paul's feelings for Heather had turned darker after the breakup. The first major lead in the case came when Montgomery and her team discovered that Paul Jackson had been in the area near the Burt Gilman Trail on the night of Heather's murder. Paul's alibi was shaky, and he had a history of minor criminal activity, including a few arrests related to alcohol and disorderly conduct. Despite this, there was no hard evidence linking him directly to Heather's murder. The investigation continued, with Montgomery and her team searching for any further clues that could shed light on who had committed such a heinous act. Days passed, and the investigation seemed to stall. However, a breakthrough came when a local resident, who had been walking her dog along the trail the morning after the murder, came forward with a critical piece of information. She had witnessed a man behaving strangely in the vicinity of the crime scene on the day before Heather's body was discovered. The witness described the man as tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, and acting nervously as he walked in and out of the trees along the trail. The description did not match Paul Jackson, but it was still valuable information. Detective Montgomery carefully reviewed the witness statement and had a composite sketch of the man created. The sketch was widely circulated to the public, hoping someone might recognize the individual. The sketch did not initially produce any leads, but Montgomery remained persistent. She believed that this man was somehow connected to Heather's death, and she was determined to find out who he was. As the investigation moved forward, Montgomery and her team reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses, hoping to find any visual evidence that could lead to the identification of the suspect. After days of sifting through footage, they were able to identify the man in the composite sketch entering a nearby convenience store on the night of the murder. He had purchased a pack of cigarettes and appeared to be in a hurry. His face was obscured by the baseball cap, but Montgomery knew this was a crucial lead. The man's movements suggested he was familiar with the area, and the fact that he had been in the vicinity of Heather's body hours before it was discovered indicated a strong possibility that he had been involved in the crime. The investigation took an unexpected turn when it was revealed that the man in the convenience store footage was not a stranger to the police. His name was Eric Donovan, a 28-year-old man with a history of mental health issues and a criminal record. Donovan had been arrested several times over the years for petty theft and vandalism, but there was no record of violent crime associated with his name. He had lived in the Seattle area for several years, often moving between temporary housing arrangements, and had a reputation for being unpredictable and erratic. Police records indicated that Donovan had been in and out of psychiatric institutions over the years, and it was unclear whether he was receiving proper treatment at the time of Heather's murder. Montgomery and her team were quick to track Donovan down. They located him at a local shelter, where he had been staying for the past few weeks. When they brought him in for questioning, Donovan was initially cooperative, but quickly became agitated as the interrogation progressed. He denied any involvement in Heather's death, insisting that he had been nowhere near the Burt Gilman Trail on the night of the murder. However, when the police presented the surveillance footage of him in the convenience store, his story began to unravel. Donovan's behavior during the interrogation was erratic. He became increasingly defensive and inconsistent in his statements, and Montgomery began to suspect that he was hiding something. As the hours wore on, Donovan's resistance started to fade, and he eventually admitted that he had been near the Burt Gilman Trail on the night of Heather's murder. He explained that he had been walking along the trail to clear his mind, but denied any involvement in the crime itself. It wasn't until Donovan's fingerprints were found on a pack of cigarettes near Heather's body that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The physical evidence, combined with his inconsistent statements, led Montgomery to conclude that Eric Donovan was indeed responsible for Heather McDonald's murder. It turned out that Donovan had become fixated on Heather after seeing her while walking along the trail in the weeks leading up to the murder. In his delusional state, he believed that Heather was the key to solving his personal problems and that she had somehow wronged him. His mental instability, combined with a history of violent impulses, had led to the tragic and senseless murder. The arrest of Eric Donovan brought an end to the investigation, but it left behind a community devastated by the loss of Heather McDonald. She had been a bright young woman with a promising future, and her death had left a hole in the lives of those who loved her. The case also shed light on the often overlooked issue of mental illness and the danger posed by individuals who, though they may not have a history of violent crime, are still capable of committing terrible acts when their mental state deteriorates. Detective Montgomery's determination had brought closure to the case, but the investigation was a sobering reminder of how fragile life could be. Heather McDonald's murder was a tragedy that left a mark on everyone involved, and it served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. While justice had been served, the pain of losing someone so young and full of potential would never fully heal. The case of Heather McDonald would haunt the city of Seattle for years to come, and Detective Montgomery would always carry the weight of it with her as a reminder of the complexities and darkness that can hide behind a seemingly ordinary face. As Detective Montgomery continued her investigation, she realized that while Eric Donovan was emerging as the prime suspect, there were still several unanswered questions. Donovan's erratic behavior during the initial questioning left her feeling unsettled, and she knew that understanding his motivations was crucial to unraveling the truth. As she pieced together the fragments of evidence, Montgomery found herself digging deeper into Donovan's past, hoping that the key to understanding his actions lay hidden somewhere in his history. Montgomery and her team scoured through Eric Donovan's criminal and psychiatric records. They discovered that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia during his late teens. Over the years, Donovan had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities for treatment, but it was clear that his mental health had deteriorated, especially in the months leading up to Heather McDonald's murder. According to his records, Donovan had been discharged from a mental health facility just a few weeks prior to Heather's death. At the time, his doctors had warned that he might not be stable enough to live independently, but Donovan had insisted on leaving, citing that he could manage his condition on his own. The fact that Donovan had recently been released from psychiatric care was a red flag. Montgomery began to suspect that he might have been off his medication when the murder occurred, which could have contributed to his delusional thinking and violent behavior. In many of his previous episodes, Donovan had shown a tendency to fixate on individuals, becoming obsessed with them to the point of delusion. There was no indication that he had ever been violent before, but the combination of his untreated mental illness and his fixation on Heather seemed to have culminated in the tragedy. Montgomery reviewed Donovan's interactions with others, hoping to gain insight into his mental state. She interviewed several people who had known him over the years, including former roommates and neighbors. Most of them described Donovan as harmless but eccentric. He was known to have bouts of strange behavior, such as talking to himself and claiming to hear voices, but he had never shown signs of being dangerous. Some recalled that he would often speak about his frustrations with life and his inability to find a meaningful connection with others. It was during one of these conversations that Donovan had mentioned seeing a woman on the Burke-Gilman Trail, a woman he had admired from afar. She was Heather McDonald, though Donovan had never spoken to her directly. He had become obsessed with the idea of her being the person who could help him find peace. The more Montgomery learned about Donovan, the more she realized that his fixation on Heather wasn't just a passing infatuation. It had become an obsession. He had been walking the Burke-Gilman Trail regularly, hoping to run into her, and he had been watching her from a distance for weeks before the murder. It appeared that Donovan had created a fantasy in his mind, convinced that Heather was the answer to all his problems. His delusions, combined with his mental instability, had led him to believe that Heather was somehow responsible for his misfortune in life, and in his distorted view of reality, he thought he had no choice but to eliminate her. The investigation revealed that Donovan had seen Heather only a few times while she was out jogging, but he had fixated on her after one particular encounter. On one of his walks along the trail, He had briefly exchanged glances with Heather as she passed by, and in his mind, that moment had been far more significant than it was in reality. Donovan had convinced himself that Heather had rejected him, that she had somehow looked at him with disdain. It was this perceived rejection that fueled his rage and spiraled him further into a violent obsession. As Montgomery pieced together the details of Donovan's interactions with Heather, she also uncovered evidence of his increasingly erratic behavior leading up to the murder. Witnesses reported seeing him in the days before the crime, acting nervously and pacing around the trail, as if waiting for something or someone. It became clear that he had been lurking in the area, hoping for an opportunity to confront Heather. His delusions had taken a dark turn, and it seemed that he had come to believe that he needed to eliminate the source of his frustration, Heather herself. The morning of Heather's murder, Donovan was seen by a few joggers walking along the trail. He had been in the area for hours before the crime took place, and it appeared that he had been waiting for the right moment to strike. At around 10 a.m., Heather had arrived at the trail as part of her usual morning jog. Donovan, who had been watching her from behind a row of trees, suddenly approached her. Witnesses later described seeing him walk toward her, speaking to her in a soft, incoherent manner, though none of them could hear the exact words. Some believed that he had tried to engage her in conversation, but Heather had likely felt uncomfortable and tried to move past him quickly. It was unclear exactly what happened in the moments that followed, but it was evident that Donovan's delusions had overtaken his rational thinking. He had believed that Heather was mocking him, that she had refused to acknowledge him. In his distorted mind, her indifference had been an insult too great to bear. He quickly became violent, forcing Heather into the nearby woods, where he strangled her with his bare hands, silencing her as she fought for her life. After the murder, Donovan had wandered around the trail in a daze. He discarded his jacket and threw the pack of cigarettes he had purchased earlier near Heather's body in an attempt to cover his tracks. He left the scene in a state of confusion, unable to comprehend the gravity of what he had done. The next few days were a blur for Donovan. He was both terrified and strangely detached from the reality of his actions. He wandered the streets, staying in homeless shelters, trying to avoid drawing attention to himself. But the police were already piecing together the evidence, and it wasn't long before Donovan became the primary suspect. When Detective Montgomery finally confronted Donovan with the evidence, he initially denied everything, but his demeanor betrayed him. The physical evidence, his fingerprints on the pack of cigarettes and his presence near the crime scene, was damning. As the interrogation progressed, Donovan's facade of innocence crumbled, and he eventually confessed to the murder, though his motives remained muddled. He insisted that he hadn't intended to kill Heather. He had only wanted to make her understand his pain, but in his disturbed state, he had gone too far. Donovan's arrest brought a sense of relief to the city, but it did little to ease the grief of Heather McDonald's family and friends. The community was left to grapple with the tragedy of a young life taken too soon by the unchecked forces of mental illness and obsession. The investigation had uncovered a harrowing truth, that sometimes the most dangerous individuals were not those with a history of violent crime, but those whose minds were fragile, broken by the weight of their own delusions. For Detective Montgomery, the case was a sobering reminder of the complexity of human behavior. It wasn't just about finding the perpetrator. It was about understanding the forces that led someone to commit such a senseless and violent act. Eric Donovan's story was a tragic one, and while justice had been served, it would never bring back the life of Heather McDonald. The case would haunt Montgomery for years to come, a constant reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the devastating consequences that could arise when it shattered. Detective Montgomery's investigation was far from over, and as she delved deeper into Eric Donovan's troubled past, the more complicated the case became. While Donovan's confession had provided some closure, the deeper she dug, the more she began to question how such a tragedy could have been prevented. In her pursuit of justice for Heather McDonald, Montgomery found herself exploring not only Donovan's criminal history, but also the mental health system and its failure to adequately address his needs. The case had become more than just a murder investigation. It was a reflection of the dark reality that mental illness, when left untreated, could lead to devastating consequences. After Donovan's arrest, Montgomery had met with Heather McDonald's parents, both of whom were devastated by the loss of their daughter. They spoke about Heather's love for life, her dreams of helping others, and how she had always gone above and beyond to make a difference in the world. The McDonalds were understandably struggling to make sense of their daughter's senseless murder. They asked Montgomery countless questions. What had gone wrong? Why had Heather been targeted? How could someone like Donovan, who had no clear motive, commit such a heinous act? The answers to these questions were still elusive, but Montgomery was determined to find the truth. She felt a deep sense of responsibility to Heather's family, to understand what had led to the murder, and how she could prevent something like this from happening again. She continued her investigation, uncovering more about Donovan's background, and soon, she discovered that his history was not as straightforward as it first appeared. As Montgomery examined Donovan's psychiatric history more thoroughly, she found that his doctors had repeatedly warned that he posed a risk to others if he was allowed to live independently. Despite this, he had been discharged from treatment just days before the murder. In a disturbing twist, Montgomery found that Donovan had stopped taking his prescribed medication several months earlier. His doctors had noted a significant decline in his mental health during this period, but no one had taken further action to prevent him from falling through the cracks. The more Montgomery learned about Donovan's medical history, the more it became clear that his condition was not an isolated case. He had been part of a larger group of individuals who had slipped through the cracks of the mental health system, people who were struggling with untreated mental illnesses, but who didn't have the resources or support they needed to seek help. Donovan's case was a tragic example of how mental illness could go unnoticed or untreated, with devastating consequences. Montgomery felt a growing sense of frustration as she realized that the system had failed Donovan, just as it had failed Heather. Donovan's family had tried to get him the help he needed, but they too had been overwhelmed by the complexities of navigating the mental health system. The lack of a coordinated effort and the lack of adequate resources had allowed Donovan's condition to worsen unchecked, leading to a tragedy that could have been prevented. As Montgomery's investigation moved forward, she began to look more closely at how the mental health system could have been improved to prevent similar tragedies. She met with professionals in the field, hoping to understand how better systems could be put in place to catch individuals like Donovan before it was too late. It became apparent to her that while there were many dedicated mental health professionals, the system itself was deeply flawed. The resources available were limited, and individuals who needed care often found themselves on long waiting lists or unable to access the help they desperately needed. At the same time, Montgomery couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. What could have been done differently? How could Heather's murder have been prevented? The system was designed to treat those who sought help, but it wasn't equipped to intervene with individuals like Donovan who were unable or unwilling to recognize the seriousness of their condition. Heather's murder had highlighted the failure of the system to provide adequate care for those suffering from mental illness, and Montgomery began to wonder if there was a way to change the way society viewed and treated mental health issues. In the weeks following Donovan's arrest, Heather's parents worked with Montgomery to establish a foundation in Heather's name, dedicated to raising awareness about mental health and advocating for changes in the system. The foundation aimed to create better resources for individuals with mental illness, particularly those who, like Donovan, were at risk of slipping through the cracks. Heather's parents were determined to ensure that their daughter's death would not be in vain, that her memory could be honored by making a real, lasting difference in the way society approached mental health. Meanwhile, Eric Donovan remained in custody, awaiting trial. His behavior in prison continued to be erratic, and he was placed in solitary confinement after several outbursts. He would spend hours pacing in his cell, muttering to himself, seemingly disconnected from reality. His mental state continued to deteriorate, and it became evident to everyone involved in the case that Donovan was still deeply affected by his delusions. Even in the face of his incarceration, Donovan seemed to struggle with the realization of what he had done, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions. Despite his admission of guilt, Donovan's defense team began to build a case around his mental illness, arguing that he had been in a psychotic state at the time of the murder and therefore could not be held fully responsible for his actions. The trial was expected to be a lengthy and complex process, with experts debating whether Donovan was criminally responsible or whether his mental illness had completely overpowered his ability to control his actions. It was a painful and drawn-out process for Heather's family, who had to relive the trauma of their daughter's death while awaiting justice. As the case moved through the legal system, Montgomery continued to work tirelessly, following every lead and ensuring that the investigation remained thorough. She met with Heather's parents regularly, keeping them updated on any developments in the case and offering support during the difficult months that followed. They were deeply grateful for Montgomery's dedication and they knew that she was doing everything in her power to bring their daughter's killer to justice. Meanwhile, the city of Seattle was left to grapple with the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The murder of Heather McDonald had sent shockwaves through the community, and many people began to question the safety of their own neighborhoods. The Burt Gilman Trail, once a peaceful place for jogging and cycling, became a symbol of the unpredictable and sometimes violent nature of life. People wondered if they could ever feel safe again in the places they had once considered serene. Despite the lingering sense of unease, the case of Heather McDonald's murder ultimately sparked important conversations about mental health, the failures of the healthcare system, and the need for better resources and support for those struggling with mental illness. It was clear that the tragedy could have been prevented if only Donovan had received the proper care, if only the system had recognized the warning signs. Heather's murder was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a symptom of a deeper, more systemic issue. Through all the pain, grief, and confusion, Montgomery remained determined to ensure that Heather's death would lead to meaningful change. As the trial approached, she knew that the journey was far from over. But she also knew that by raising awareness about the failures of the mental health system, they could prevent future tragedies from occurring. Heather's life, while tragically cut short, had not been in vain. Her story, and the story of her killer, Eric Donovan, had become a catalyst for change. And for Montgomery, that was the only way she could reconcile the senseless loss and bring some measure of peace to Heather's family and the community. As the months dragged on, the trial of Eric Donovan continued to dominate the headlines, and the public's focus remained fixed on the complex intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the failure of the healthcare system. Heather McDonald's death, though painful, had given rise to a growing dialogue about how society treats individuals suffering from severe mental health conditions and the widespread lack of adequate support for those at risk of falling through the cracks. In the midst of the ongoing legal battle, Detective Montgomery found herself reflecting more deeply on the case, its broader implications, and what it had taught her about the world she worked in. Montgomery spent many nights reviewing the case files and the evidence she had gathered. Despite the confession, she felt a profound sense of dissatisfaction. There was no real closure, no way to bring Heather back, and even the conviction of Donovan, though a step toward justice, could not undo the irreversible damage that had been done. In her mind, she began to focus less on Donovan and more on the system itself. How many other people like him were out there, untreated and alone, and how many more tragedies could be avoided with a more compassionate, well-funded approach to mental health care. She thought back to the interviews she had conducted with Heather's parents, whose pain seemed as fresh as the day they had learned of their daughter's death. They had become advocates for mental health reform, working with Montgomery to create a memorial fund in Heather's name. The Heather McDonald Foundation was established with the aim of raising awareness about the need for better mental health care, more resources for those in need, and greater understanding within society about the challenges faced by individuals suffering from conditions like schizophrenia. It was a small victory for Heather's family in the wake of their immense loss, but Montgomery knew it was just the beginning. The trial continued to wind through the courts, with a defense team that was relentless in arguing that Donovan's actions had been the result of his untreated mental illness. The defense presented expert witnesses who testified that Donovan had been in a psychotic state when he murdered Heather, making it impossible for him to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. Montgomery watched as the legal proceedings unfolded with growing unease, as the courtroom became a battleground over mental health diagnosis and the intricacies of determining criminal responsibility. Meanwhile, Donovan's mental state continued to deteriorate in custody. The prison reports were disturbing. He had begun to show signs of paranoia, claiming that he was being watched by invisible forces. He would speak to himself in an incoherent manner, muttering about his distorted perceptions of reality. Montgomery knew that Donovan's condition was severe, but what disturbed her the most was that his symptoms were a direct result of a broken system. Donovan had once been given a chance at recovery, but that chance had slipped away when the system failed him. The more she learned about Donovan's history, the clearer it became that his spiral into violence could have been averted if he had received the care he needed earlier. The trial eventually reached its conclusion, with Eric Donovan being convicted of second-degree murder due to the substantial evidence of his mental illness at the time of the crime. The judge acknowledged Donovan's mental state, but in the end, the sentence was one of both imprisonment and psychiatric care. It was a bittersweet resolution for Heather's parents, who had hoped for something more definitive, but understood that Donovan would never be free from the grip of his mental illness. He would spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution, a place where he could receive the care he had so desperately needed all along. For Detective Montgomery, the case had left an indelible mark on her conscience. She continued to work tirelessly, but her approach to law enforcement had changed. No longer did she see her job as merely solving crimes. She now saw it as an opportunity to shed light on the deep systemic issues that affected so many lives. Montgomery became an advocate for mental health reform, speaking publicly about her experiences with the case and urging for better funding for mental health services, more community-based programs, and stricter oversight of the release of mentally unstable individuals. She knew that her work would not stop with the conviction of one man. It had to be part of a larger, sustained effort to make sure that tragedies like the one Heather had suffered would not be repeated. As the months turned into years, Montgomery continued to honor Heather's memory, and she stayed in close contact with Heather's family, who had become her friends. The Heather McDonald Foundation grew in influence, raising both funds and awareness for causes related to mental health. It was a long and often frustrating road, but Montgomery took solace in knowing that Heather's death had not been in vain. Through the foundation, the McDonalds were able to provide grants for research, fund programs for families coping with mental illness, and offer scholarships for students pursuing careers in mental health care. They were determined to ensure that their daughter's legacy would live on in a way that could truly make a difference in the lives of others. On the anniversary of Heather's death, the foundation held an annual event, and Montgomery would attend every year, standing by the McDonalds as they remembered their daughter. It was at one of these events that Montgomery was approached by a young woman who had once been a client of one of the foundation's mental health programs. The woman, who had struggled with her own battle with schizophrenia, thanked Montgomery for her work and for helping bring attention to the importance of treating those with mental health disorders with the compassion and respect they deserved. She spoke of how the foundation had given her hope and how she had been able to get the care she needed because of the efforts of Montgomery and the McDonalds. It was moments like these that reminded Montgomery why she had chosen to pursue this line of work. The case had changed her life, but it had also had a profound impact on the lives of so many others. Heather McDonald's legacy was not one of pain and loss alone. It was also one of hope, advocacy, and change. Montgomery, though still haunted by the tragedy, knew that she had been part of something larger than herself, something that had the potential to make a real difference in the world. As the years passed, Donovan's name faded from the headlines, his life largely confined to the psychiatric facility where he would remain for the rest of his days. But for Montgomery, the case would never be forgotten. She carried the lessons of Heather McDonald's death with her, striving every day to make the world a better, safer place for those who needed help the most. The story of Heather, of Donovan, and of the broken system that allowed such a tragedy to unfold was one that would remain with her forever, fueling her dedication to a cause that, in the end, was about more than just solving a murder. It was about making sure that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. Story 3. In the year 2000, one of the most infamous robberies in American history took place in a small town in Pennsylvania. The robbery, later known as the Midtown Heist, would become a case that both the local police and FBI would struggle to crack for years. It began on an unassuming Tuesday morning in late March, when a masked man entered a local bank in the heart of downtown. The man, later identified as Richard "Rick" Daniels, had spent weeks planning the robbery meticulously. He knew that this particular branch, while often bustling, had a minimal security presence compared to the larger banks in the area. It was the perfect target for what he had in mind. Rick Daniels had never been in trouble with the law before, and on the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary man, a middle-aged, nondescript man who worked as a carpenter and lived a quiet life in a modest home on the outskirts of the town. However, Daniels had long been struggling with debts and a history of gambling, which had gradually begun to spiral out of control. After exhausting all his resources and even resorting to borrowing from friends and family, Daniels saw only one way out: he would rob a bank. The day of the robbery arrived, and Daniels entered the bank dressed in a dark coat and sunglasses, hiding his face behind a black mask. Armed with a .45 caliber handgun, he immediately made his way to the teller's counter. He was calm, almost eerily so, as he handed over a note demanding cash, which he wrote in advance. The note was simple: fill the bag with cash. No alarms. No one gets hurt. It was clear from the moment he spoke that Daniels had rehearsed his lines and knew exactly what to do. The bank was relatively quiet that morning, and there were only a handful of customers in line, none of whom realized the gravity of the situation until it was too late. Daniel's tone remained measured as he barked at the tellers to comply with his demands. The tellers, though terrified, followed his instructions without hesitation. They quickly gathered stacks of cash, placing the money in a duffel bag that Daniels had brought with him. It was over in a matter of minutes. As the tellers handed him the last of the money, Daniels grabbed the duffel bag and made his way toward the exit. As he walked out the door, he glanced back at the bank's security camera, momentarily making eye contact with the lens. It was a brief moment, but it would later become a crucial detail in the investigation. Once outside, Daniels hopped into a getaway vehicle, a blue Ford sedan, which was parked a short distance from the bank. The car had been rented under a fake name, and it was equipped with a hidden GPS tracker. Daniels had taken every precaution to cover his tracks, from wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints to selecting a car that wouldn't draw attention. He had planned his escape route carefully, driving through narrow back streets to avoid detection. But what Daniels didn't count on was the efficiency of the bank's surveillance system. The cameras had captured him clearly, and despite the mask, authorities would be able to get a good look at his build and posture. The robbery shocked the small town, as it was one of the first major crimes of its kind to occur in years. The local police were immediately called to the scene, and the FBI was soon brought in to assist with the investigation. The small-town police department, though experienced, didn't have the resources or expertise to handle such a high-profile case on their own, and they knew that this would be no ordinary robbery. Detective Emily Hayes, a seasoned investigator with the FBI, was assigned to the case. She quickly arrived at the bank, where she was briefed by local officers. Hayes was no stranger to robberies, but this one was unique. The robber had been methodical, leaving little in terms of evidence or clues. The bank's surveillance footage, while useful, didn't provide any clear identifiers. There was no indication that Daniels had been a repeat criminal, and there was no pattern to suggest he had committed similar crimes in the past. The robbery seemed like the work of a man who had no prior criminal history, someone who had planned carefully and executed the crime with cold precision. Hayes and her team immediately began reviewing the security footage in greater detail. The footage was grainy, but they were able to enhance some of the frames. They focused on the man's posture and movements as he entered and exited the bank. He was cautious, but not panicked, as though he had done this before. There was a brief moment when the camera caught him glancing at the lens, and although his face was obscured by the mask, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about his demeanor. She wasn't sure what it was, but it seemed like more than just a random robbery. The investigation led Hayes to focus on Daniel's personal life. She learned that he had lived a relatively quiet existence in the town, working as a carpenter and maintaining a low profile. There was little to suggest that he was involved in anything criminal, which made the robbery all the more puzzling. She began to uncover the financial troubles Daniels had been facing, including a mounting gambling debt that had been spiraling out of control for months. It became clear that Daniels had not planned this robbery on a whim. It was a desperate act, born out of sheer financial need. As Detective Hayes and her team dug deeper into Daniel's life, they discovered that he had been under increasing pressure, losing money on poker games and other bets. His gambling addiction had grown so severe that it had begun to impact his ability to provide for his family. Daniels had tried to hide his problems from his wife, but she eventually discovered the extent of his debts. When confronted, Daniels became defensive, and his wife threatened to leave him if he didn't seek help. It was around this time that Daniels hatched the plan for the robbery. He saw it as his only way out, a quick and easy solution to his financial troubles. Hayes couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Daniels as she learned about his struggles. While she couldn't excuse his actions, she understood the desperation that had driven him to commit the crime. In some ways, Daniel's story was a tragic reflection of the pressures and temptations that many people faced, particularly those struggling with addiction. But sympathy wouldn't solve the case. Hayes knew that finding Daniels and bringing him to justice was the only way to prevent him from committing another crime. The FBI's resources were now fully dedicated to locating him, and as the investigation progressed, they discovered more details about his escape route. The GPS tracker on the rented getaway car had been activated shortly after the robbery, and authorities were able to track its movements in real time. However, Daniels had anticipated this move, and by the time the FBI located the car, it had already been abandoned, with no sign of him in the area. With no clear leads and Daniels nowhere to be found, the investigation entered a new phase. Detective Hayes and her team shifted their focus to the larger network of people Daniels might have interacted with, his friends, his colleagues, and anyone who might have known about his financial problems. But each lead turned up empty, and the case seemed to stall. The robbery itself had been a success for Daniels, but the aftermath was quickly unraveling as the FBI closed in. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that finding Rick Daniels would not be as easy as they had hoped. The investigation continued to evolve as the FBI expanded its efforts across the state, launching a full-scale manhunt for Rick Daniels. Detective Hayes and her team were now focused on piecing together every detail about his life, his habits, and his social connections. Despite the immediate success of the robbery, Daniels' lack of a criminal history and the almost perfect execution of the crime made him a particularly elusive suspect. For every lead they followed, the trail seemed to grow colder, and Hayes couldn't shake the sense that Daniels was always one step ahead. The rented getaway vehicle was a key piece of evidence. After abandoning it in a remote area outside of town, Daniels had presumably hitchhiked or made his way to a new location. The car, which had been discovered several miles from the bank, had been wiped clean of any fingerprints or traceable evidence. There were no witnesses who had seen him leave the car, and it had been parked in a manner that suggested Daniels knew exactly what he was doing, carefully positioning the vehicle so it would be hard to spot from a distance. This level of careful planning seemed to indicate that Daniels had been planning the robbery for some time, perhaps longer than anyone had anticipated. The FBI soon learned that Daniels had used a variety of different methods to cover his tracks. The GPS tracker had been the only reason they were able to locate the car at all, but once they tracked it to its final destination, Daniels had been nowhere to be found. The car had been left in a densely wooded area near an industrial park, but there were no signs of struggle or haste. He had simply disappeared. Detective Hayes reviewed every moment of the bank's surveillance footage again, this time with a heightened sense of urgency. She studied the way Daniels moved, his deliberate gait and confident stride as he walked to the teller's counter. She noticed how his hands never shook, how his movements were steady, despite the high-pressure situation. It was as though he had done this before, even though there was no evidence to suggest he had ever been involved in any previous criminal activity. This nagging feeling of familiarity, of something hidden just out of reach, kept haunting Hayes. She made a mental note to look more closely into Daniels' background, particularly his past employment. While Daniels was a carpenter by trade, Hayes wondered if he had been involved in any other illicit activities. The more she dug into his work history, the more she began to uncover small inconsistencies in the details Daniels had provided. He had, it seemed, taken odd jobs for various people in different towns in the months leading up to the robbery, and some of the work had been paid in cash. While this was not inherently suspicious, the sheer volume of cash transactions made Hayes wonder if Daniels had been involved in something else, perhaps a network of people who had helped him plan the robbery. As the weeks passed, the case began to stretch out with few developments. Hayes and her team were growing increasingly frustrated. The lack of substantial evidence combined with Daniels' clever evasion tactics made it feel as though they were chasing a ghost. Yet they refused to give up. They expanded their search to nearby cities and towns, running the plates of any vehicles that seemed suspicious, and talking to people who might have encountered Daniels in the days following the robbery. However, every lead turned into a dead end. At the same time, Daniels had been struggling to maintain his sense of control over his life. Having successfully executed the robbery, he now faced the overwhelming reality of what he had done. He had enough money to pay off his gambling debts and take care of his immediate needs, but he knew that running would only prolong the inevitable. The weight of his actions began to press heavily on him, and he struggled with the guilt of abandoning his family and the fear that eventually someone would come for him. Daniels had no intention of returning to his family, not after everything he had done. But the pressure of living a life in hiding was starting to get to him. The guilt gnawed at him, and he found himself moving from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. He lived off the money from the robbery, but it was running out faster than he anticipated. Daniels knew he couldn't stay anonymous forever, and the paranoia he once avoided was starting to set in. Every shadow seemed like a potential threat, and every car that passed by seemed to carry law enforcement closing in on him. By late April, Detective Hayes had decided to take a more aggressive approach. While the search for Daniels in Pennsylvania had yielded no solid leads, they received word of a possible sighting in Ohio, a state not far from Pennsylvania. The tip came from a gas station attendant who recognized Daniels from the bank's surveillance footage. The attendant had seen a man matching Daniels' description, filling up a car late at night. It was a fleeting moment, but Hayes immediately dispatched a team to Ohio to follow up on the lead. Hayes and her team arrived in Ohio, where they began speaking with local law enforcement, who had been briefed on the case. The search was extensive, covering various motels, truck stops, and gas stations in the area. Despite this, they still had no direct confirmation that Daniels was in Ohio, but they worked tirelessly, scanning through every piece of information they could find. The breakthrough came when they reviewed a series of nearby surveillance cameras. A man matching Daniels' description was seen entering a small diner late at night, just a few miles from where the gas station attendant had seen him. The camera footage was grainy, but the figure's posture and gait were unmistakable. This new lead sparked a renewed sense of hope in the investigation. Hayes immediately directed her team to that diner, where they began questioning the staff. The staff had not remembered Daniels specifically, but several recalled seeing a man who appeared nervous and out of place. One of the employees reported that the man had paid for his meal with cash, making no effort to hide his transactions. The fact that Daniels had chosen a place so close to where he had been spotted earlier seemed to suggest that he was growing more careless with time. The next morning, Hayes and her team reviewed every known route that Daniels could have taken, carefully mapping out the locations where he might have gone next. Based on the diner's proximity to a local highway, Hayes suspected that Daniels might have been planning to travel further east, possibly toward the coast. They arranged for an extensive roadblock along the main highways, hoping that Daniels, in his desperation, would attempt to travel out of state. Days turned into weeks again, and still, there was no sign of Rick Daniels. But the case, far from forgotten, was far from closed. Hayes and her team worked tirelessly to connect the dots, slowly piecing together a clearer picture of a man who had been driven to extreme measures by a financial crisis, only to find himself trapped by his own decisions. As weeks passed, the investigation into Rick Daniels grew increasingly complex. Despite the intense efforts of the FBI and local law enforcement, the manhunt showed no signs of letting up. Daniels' ability to stay off the radar was becoming a source of both admiration and frustration for the agents chasing him. While his face had been caught on the bank's security cameras, Daniels had been diligent in covering his tracks. The various false leads, sightings, and moments of misdirection were taking their toll on the investigation, but Detective Hayes and her team remained resolute. They knew that every lead they pursued brought them closer to uncovering his location, even if it felt as if they were merely grasping at straws. The breakthrough came when a former colleague of Daniels came forward with a chilling tip. It had been a simple conversation between friends at a bar, the kind that could easily be dismissed if not for the peculiar detail that caught Hayes' attention. Daniels had made a passing comment to his colleague about needing to disappear for a while, though at the time, it seemed more like idle chatter than a serious confession. When this same colleague saw Daniels' face on the news following the robbery, he realized that Daniels might have been planning his escape well before the heist itself. He had noticed subtle signs of anxiety in Daniels in the weeks leading up to the robbery, the same signs that now seemed to match the behavior of a man planning a life-changing crime. With this new information, Hayes decided to expand the scope of their search. Daniels, having lived a relatively normal life in a small town, likely had connections outside the region, perhaps people who could help him hide or even provide financial assistance. The colleague mentioned that Daniels had once made a remark about a family member in New York, suggesting that he might have been considering using them as a safe haven. This hint about a possible link to the city was a glimmer of hope in the dark, a potential lead that had the power to finally break the case wide open. Hayes quickly coordinated with the FBI's New York branch to investigate this lead. New York was a city known for its dense population and complex web of neighborhoods, making it an ideal location for someone trying to disappear. Local agents began to comb through records of known associates, possible hideouts, and even family members living in the area. Meanwhile, Daniels was still on the move, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. Rick Daniels' behavior during this period was erratic. The money he had stolen in the bank heist, although substantial, was running out faster than he anticipated. Daniels had been living off it to maintain a low profile, but the lifestyle of living in hiding proved more expensive than he had imagined. The stress of avoiding detection was taking its toll on him. He had avoided using his real identity, knowing that every purchase and every interaction could expose him. He stayed in motels, paid for items in cash, and avoided talking to anyone who might recognize him. His only contact with the outside world was sporadic, often relying on burner phones to communicate. As the search for him intensified, Daniels found himself becoming increasingly paranoid. The fleeting sightings, like the one in Ohio, had been enough to rattle his nerves. He no longer felt safe in the familiar places he had once visited without a second thought. Every passing vehicle made him flinch. Every stranger who looked in his direction felt like a threat. His confidence, which had once been the hallmark of his successful robbery, began to erode under the pressure of his circumstances. Meanwhile, in New York, the FBI's efforts to locate Daniels were slowly paying off. They were able to trace an old address that Daniels had once used for a distant relative. The relative, an aunt living in the Bronx, had not been in contact with him for years, but agents discovered that she had been renting an apartment in a part of the city that was densely populated. The likelihood that Daniels would seek refuge there grew stronger with each passing day. The apartment was in a complex that catered to lower-income families, an area where someone could blend in with relative ease. Detective Hayes, after coordinating with the New York team, decided to travel there herself. She understood that this could be the crucial lead that would finally bring Daniels to justice, and she was determined not to let this opportunity slip away. She arrived in the Bronx a few days later, where she was briefed by local law enforcement on the latest developments. The team quickly gathered at the complex where Daniels' aunt lived. Hayes and her colleagues methodically went door to door, speaking to residents and canvassing the area for any sign of Daniels. On the third day of searching, a break came when a local shopkeeper reported seeing a man matching Daniels' description in the store just a few days prior. The shopkeeper recalled that the man had seemed nervous, but was able to pay for his groceries with a stack of cash. Though the shopkeeper had not initially realized who he was speaking with, the details of the interaction matched the behavior of someone trying to remain under the radar. It was clear that Daniels was in the area, and likely staying close by. The news spread quickly, and within hours, the FBI had set up surveillance around the complex. They observed the building from a distance, watching for any unusual movements or suspicious activity. The longer they watched, the more convinced they became that Daniels was hiding in one of the nearby apartments. The problem, however, was that there was no concrete evidence linking him directly to any particular apartment. His aunt had not been seen at home for several days, further complicating matters. Without any immediate cause for a search warrant, the agents had to rely on subtle observation, waiting for a moment when Daniels might slip up. As days turned into weeks once again, Daniels remained elusive, slipping through their fingers just as he had on multiple occasions before. He had grown accustomed to evading the authorities, and his ability to stay hidden seemed to defy logic. But as time passed, the net around him continued to tighten. Detective Hayes knew it was only a matter of time before Daniels made a mistake. He had already made one with the robbery, and sooner or later, that mistake would catch up with him. In a city as vast and chaotic as New York, it was easy to disappear. But the more Daniels tried to cover his tracks, the more the authorities closed in. Each move he made only made it easier for the FBI to follow, and soon, they would be one step away from finally catching the man who had committed the infamous Midtown heist. After weeks of waiting and watching, the breakthrough finally came. Detective Hayes and her team were growing weary, but their persistence paid off when they received an anonymous tip from a local who had noticed something unusual. The tipster described a man who had been seen entering the same apartment complex where Daniels' aunt lived, but this time, the description matched Daniels more specifically. The man had entered the building under the cover of night, carrying what appeared to be a large bag, the kind that might contain valuables or stolen items. This was the moment Hayes had been hoping for, the confirmation they needed to make their move. She quickly assembled a team of local agents and FBI personnel, ensuring that all the necessary precautions were taken. Daniels had already proven that he was resourceful and elusive, so they couldn't afford any mistakes. They couldn't risk losing him again. The plan was simple, a coordinated effort to surround the building while keeping their presence as discreet as possible. Hayes knew that Daniels, in his paranoia, would likely try to flee if he sensed any danger. They needed to catch him off guard before he could escape into the maze of the city. The team set up their perimeter, each agent in place to cover all exits from the complex. Meanwhile, Hayes and a select group of officers made their way to the apartment where Daniels was believed to be hiding. As they approached the building, every step felt heavier than the last. The tension was palpable. This was the culmination of months of chasing a ghost, and the fear of failure weighed heavily on everyone involved. The closer they got, the more Hayes' mind raced, running through every possibility, every contingency. If Daniels was truly in there, he wouldn't go down without a fight. But they had no choice. They had to act quickly. They reached the door to Daniels' aunt's apartment, and, after a tense moment of silence, Hayes nodded. The team moved into position. One officer knocked lightly on the door, while others stood ready to breach it if necessary. There was no response at first, and for a moment, it felt like the door might never open. But then a slight rustling sound from inside broke the silence. Hayes' heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of someone's silhouette. The man who stepped into view was tall, with his head bowed slightly, a posture Hayes immediately recognized from the surveillance footage. Rick Daniels. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that moment, Hayes saw the man who had been evading capture for so long. His face, though older and worn, was unmistakable. Daniels seemed frozen in place, his body tense as though he were deciding whether to fight or flee. Hayes knew that this was the critical moment. With a quick hand gesture, she signaled the agents to move in, ensuring they surrounded him before he had a chance to react. Daniel seemed to snap out of his daze and bolted toward the back of the apartment. The agents were quick to follow, but he was fast, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might make it to an open window or door. Hayes' instincts kicked in, and she ran after him, determined not to let him slip away again. She reached him just as he neared the kitchen, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him to the ground. Daniel struggled, trying to break free, but the weight of the situation quickly became clear. He was trapped. The agents swarmed in, securing him and cuffing him before he had any chance to resist further. Hayes stood over him, her breath heavy as the adrenaline surged through her veins. Daniels, panting and wide-eyed, finally stopped struggling. His fate was sealed. The long months of chasing, the countless false leads, and the frustrating dead ends had all led to this moment. He was in custody. The apartment, which had once seemed like a sanctuary to Daniels, now felt like a prison. As he was escorted out of the building and into a waiting vehicle, the realization hit him. He had been caught. All the money from the robbery, all the careful planning, and all the time spent evading the law had been for nothing. His life had spiraled out of control, and now, facing a long list of charges, including armed robbery, assault, and a potential federal sentence, Daniel's future was uncertain. For Hayes, the case was finally closed, but the emotional toll of the investigation remained. As she watched Daniels being driven away, she couldn't help but think about the victims of the robbery, about the employees at the bank who had been terrorized and left with a permanent scar. She thought about the damage caused by a single man's desperation, a man who, despite his careful planning, had allowed his fear and guilt to finally catch up with him. But the work didn't stop there. The arrest of Daniels marked the beginning of a new chapter in the case. Now that he was in custody, the investigation would shift to uncovering any accomplices or connections he might have had and determining the full scope of his criminal activities. There was also the matter of the stolen money, much of which remained unaccounted for. But for now, Detective Hayes allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The city had been shaken by the Midtown heist, but the man who had caused the chaos was finally behind bars. As the investigation continued, the case would serve as a reminder of the complexities of criminal behavior, the lengths to which some people would go to escape their past, and the resilience of those who pursued justice relentlessly. Detective Hayes knew that there were more criminals out there, waiting to make their own mark on the world. But for now, she could take solace in the fact that this one had been brought to justice. Story 4. In the year 2000, a robbery took place in the heart of downtown Los Angeles that would go down in history as one of the most daring and meticulously planned heists in the city's criminal history. The target was a high-end jewelry store located on a busy street lined with luxury boutiques and upscale restaurants. The store, known for its rare and valuable collection of diamonds, watches, and fine jewelry, had become a popular spot for celebrities and wealthy clients, making it an ideal target for a criminal mastermind. The robbery was executed with surgical precision. The criminals, who would later be identified as a group of 4 individuals, had spent months meticulously planning every detail. They knew the layout of the store, the schedules of its employees, the security systems, and the location of the vault where the most valuable pieces were kept. They also knew that the jewelry store had recently received a shipment of rare diamonds, which had been highly publicized in the media, making it an even more tempting target. The heist took place on a Friday afternoon, during peak business hours. The robbers, dressed in professional attire, blended seamlessly into the crowd of customers browsing the store. They knew that it was important to stay calm and avoid drawing attention to themselves. As the robbers casually walked through the store, they signaled to one another in subtle, prearranged gestures, signaling that it was time to make their move. At precisely 2:15 p.m., the leader of the group, a man known only as Victor, moved toward the front of the store. He pulled out a small, silenced pistol and fired a shot into the air, causing a brief moment of panic among the customers. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he shouted for everyone to get down on the ground. The other robbers, positioned strategically throughout the store, immediately began to take control of the situation. One of the robbers, a woman named Lisa, who had been positioned near the counter, swiftly moved to disable the security cameras, ensuring that they wouldn't be recorded. Another, a man named Greg, was responsible for guarding the exit and making sure no one could escape. The fourth robber, a man named James, made his way directly to the vault in the back of the store. The entire operation, from the moment they entered the store to the moment they began collecting the jewelry, lasted no more than 10 minutes. James, who had prior experience in high-level heists, was the expert when it came to cracking open safes and vaults. Using a set of tools that he had carefully smuggled into the store earlier in the day, he worked quickly and efficiently, opening the vault with precision. Inside, the diamonds, worth millions of dollars, lay in glass cases, ready to be stolen. James swiftly filled several bags with the most valuable pieces, his hands moving with practiced speed. The robbers had prepared for this moment, ensuring that they would not leave any traces behind that could link them to the crime. Meanwhile, Victor continued to keep the customers and staff under control, waving his gun in the air to maintain dominance over the situation. The store employees, terrified and helpless, obeyed his every command. Lisa and Greg watched the door, keeping a vigilant eye out for any law enforcement officers or security guards who might be on their way. There had been no indication of any police presence yet, but they couldn't take any chances. At precisely 2:25 p.m., the robbers had gathered all the jewelry they could carry. They made their way to the rear of the store, where they had parked a van in an alley behind the building. The van had been specially modified with a hidden compartment to conceal the stolen goods. The robbers moved swiftly, but they didn't rush. They knew that any mistake could be fatal. As they piled into the van, they left the store just as quietly as they had entered, blending into the heavy traffic on the busy street. The robbery was over in less than 30 minutes, and the criminals had made off with over $10 million in diamonds and high-end jewelry. They had planned every detail meticulously, and it showed. There were no alarms triggered, no surveillance footage to identify them, and no witnesses who could provide any useful information. The heist was executed flawlessly. However, the robbers didn't realize just how much attention their crime would attract in the days that followed. The sheer audacity of the robbery, combined with the enormous amount of wealth stolen, quickly made headlines across the city. The police and FBI launched an intensive investigation, scouring the area for any clues that might lead them to the criminals. However, the robbers had covered their tracks so well that, for a time, it seemed as though they would get away with the crime completely. The jewelry store, left in shock after the robbery, immediately began working with insurance companies to recover the losses. The police interviewed witnesses, but few were able to provide any concrete information about the robbers' identities. Some customers had described the robbers' clothing, but none could offer a definitive description of their faces, as the criminals had been careful to keep their heads down and avoid being recognized. Meanwhile, the robbers, having successfully completed the heist, went into hiding. They knew that it was only a matter of time before law enforcement would begin to piece together the clues and eventually track them down. The group decided to split up to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Victor, the leader, went to a remote location in Northern California, where he had connections who could help him lay low for a while. Lisa and Greg went to separate locations in Mexico, where they could sell some of the stolen jewelry and further distance themselves from the crime. James, the safecracker, went to Las Vegas, where he planned to sell the diamonds to a network of underground dealers who specialized in handling stolen goods. Despite the fact that the criminals had split up, their luck was about to run out. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into the jewelry store heist was intensifying. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department worked tirelessly, following up on every lead, no matter how small. The media coverage of the crime fueled the public's interest, with many wondering how a heist of such precision could have been pulled off in broad daylight without anyone noticing. Every angle was scrutinized, and every possibility was explored. One of the first breaks in the case came when a local pawn shop owner reported an attempt to sell a diamond ring that seemed too good to be true. The pawn shop owner, who had been in business for decades, immediately noticed that the ring appeared to be part of a high-end collection from the jewelry store that had been robbed. The man who tried to sell the ring was a middle-aged individual who appeared nervous and agitated. When questioned, he gave vague answers about how he had come to possess the ring, and his story didn't quite add up. The pawn shop owner, sensing something was off, contacted the authorities. The ring was confirmed to be one of the stolen items from the robbery. This discovery set off a chain of events that eventually led the detectives to one of the robbers, Greg. Greg, whose real name was Gary Thompson, had a criminal history that stretched back several years. He had been involved in petty thefts, car burglaries, and other low-level crimes, but nothing on the scale of the jewelry store heist. Gary, it seemed, was a small-time crook who had gotten in over his head when he had partnered with Victor, Lisa, and James for this grand theft. With Gary's name in hand, detectives began to dig deeper into his background. They discovered that he had connections to underground markets, including dealers who specialized in handling stolen goods. It wasn't long before they learned that Gary had been seen in the company of several other known criminals in the days leading up to the robbery. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and soon, Gary became their prime suspect. As the investigation progressed, detectives also began to piece together the movements of the other suspects. Lisa, who had fled to Mexico shortly after the heist, had used a false identity to rent a small apartment in a tourist-heavy area. She had kept a low profile, avoiding contact with anyone who might have recognized her. However, the authorities were able to track her down through phone records and surveillance footage from local businesses. It turned out that she had been in contact with a network of local dealers who bought and sold stolen jewelry. Meanwhile, Victor, the leader of the group, had gone underground, using a combination of false identities and connections to stay off the radar. But the police were closing in. They had traced his movements to a remote cabin in Northern California, where he was believed to be hiding out. The investigation team had uncovered that he had been in contact with various associates, some of whom had connections to known criminal organizations. The complexity of his network made it difficult to track his movements precisely, but they were determined to find him. James, the safecracker, was proving to be the most elusive of all. His time in Las Vegas had given him a significant advantage, as the city's sprawling nature made it easy to disappear into the crowd. Additionally, his involvement in underground criminal circles made it challenging for authorities to pinpoint his location. However, James had made one critical mistake. He had attempted to sell several of the stolen diamonds to an anonymous buyer, not realizing that the buyer was an undercover agent working for the FBI. The sting operation was a success, and James was finally caught, just days after making the transaction. The diamonds were recovered, and James was taken into custody without resistance. With all four suspects now identified and located, law enforcement moved into action. They coordinated efforts across multiple jurisdictions, making simultaneous arrests in Los Angeles, Mexico, and Northern California. The arrests were swift and precise, and by the end of the operation, the entire gang had been taken into custody. Victor, Lisa, James, and Gary were all charged with armed robbery, conspiracy to commit theft, and a variety of other related crimes. As the criminals were processed into the justice system, the stolen jewelry was returned to the jewelry store. The police managed to recover almost all of the diamonds, watches, and other high-value items. Although a small portion of the loot had been sold off or distributed through underground channels, the majority of the stolen goods were accounted for, and the jewelry store's owner was able to breathe a sigh of relief. The case, however, was far from over. Despite their success in capturing the robbers and recovering the majority of the stolen items, the investigation into the broader network of criminals who facilitated the sale of stolen goods was just beginning. Detectives knew that this heist was part of a much larger criminal enterprise. The connections between the robbers and underground dealers stretched across multiple states, and the authorities were determined to track down everyone involved in the operation. This led to several months of further investigations, which eventually led to the dismantling of a significant network of criminal activities that spanned from California to Nevada. As the trial for the four robbers began, the courtroom was filled with tension. The defendants, once confident in their ability to escape justice, now sat nervously in their seats, facing the consequences of their actions. The prosecution had built a strong case, presenting evidence from the robbery, witness testimony, and the recovery of the stolen goods. The defense attorneys argued that the suspects had been coerced into committing the crime by more powerful figures, but the jury was not convinced. Victor, the leader, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for his role in orchestrating the robbery. Lisa, who had played a critical role in disabling the security systems, received a 20-year sentence. James, the safecracker, was sentenced to 15 years, while Gary, the man who had tried to sell the stolen ring, was given a 10-year sentence for his involvement in the crime. The aftermath of the heist left a lasting mark on the jewelry store and the city of Los Angeles. While the store was able to recover from the robbery and return to business, the employees who had been present that day were left with deep psychological scars. Some would later report nightmares and flashbacks of the terrifying moments they had spent under the robbers' control. The robbery had not only stolen millions of dollars in goods, but also left a trail of emotional damage that would take years to heal. For law enforcement, the case was seen as a victory, a triumph of persistence, strategy, and teamwork. But for Detective Hayes and the rest of the investigation team, it was a reminder of the lengths that criminals would go to and the meticulous planning required to bring them to justice. Though the criminals had been caught, the city was left with a lingering question. How many other heists were out there, just waiting to be uncovered? As the investigation unfolded, the authorities' attention began to shift toward the intricate network that had helped the robbers carry out such a flawless heist. Though the primary criminals, Victor, Lisa, James, and Gary, had been apprehended, the larger scope of their operation was still being uncovered. Detectives soon realized that the jewelry heist was not an isolated incident, but rather a part of a broader criminal syndicate that had been operating under the radar for years. The heist in Los Angeles was only one piece in a complex web of thefts and illicit dealings. The authorities found that the group of robbers had been working with a network of fences, buyers, and smugglers who specialized in moving stolen high-value goods. These middlemen were crucial in turning the stolen diamonds and jewelry into cash, and some of them had ties to larger criminal organizations across the country. The fact that the jewelry had been stolen and distributed with such ease made it clear that this network had been operating for a long time, and that it was not just a random group of thieves. This discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement, sparking a fresh wave of investigations aimed at uncovering the full extent of the syndicate's reach. In the weeks following the arrest of the primary robbers, detectives began to track the movements of some of the individuals who had been in contact with them prior to and after the heist. One of the most significant leads came when they managed to uncover a phone call between Lisa and a known associate who went by the name Marco. Marco had been linked to a number of previous criminal activities, including car thefts and organized smuggling operations. He had also been known to purchase stolen jewelry and resell it through various underground channels. The breakthrough came when the authorities learned that Marco had been in contact with a well-known diamond dealer in Hong Kong, who had been dealing with stolen gemstones for years. This opened up a whole new line of inquiry, and the investigators realized that the criminal syndicate had international connections that made it harder to track and dismantle. Detectives quickly coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, including Interpol, to track down Marco and the Hong Kong diamond dealer. Simultaneously, back in Los Angeles, the jewelry store's owner was working closely with the police to recover as many of the stolen items as possible. Insurance claims had been filed, and the store's employees were still dealing with the trauma of the robbery. One of the most difficult challenges for the jewelry store was the impact on its reputation. The store had been known for its exclusivity and for attracting high-profile clientele, but the robbery had shaken the trust that many customers had in the store's security measures. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that the heist had been even more carefully planned than originally thought. The robbers had scouted the store for weeks, learning the routines of the employees and the timing of deliveries and shipments. They had even gone so far as to learn the schedule of the security guards and the patterns of the surveillance cameras. They had known exactly when and where to strike. The meticulous nature of the heist pointed to individuals with deep knowledge of the jewelry business and the workings of high-security systems. The detectives also discovered that James, the safecracker, had worked with a number of other criminals in the past who specialized in cracking high-tech safes and vaults. James had used his skills in several high-profile robberies across the country, but his involvement in this particular heist had been a major miscalculation. He had underestimated the level of scrutiny and the resources that would be dedicated to catching him and his associates. The undercover sting operation that eventually led to his capture had been one of the most sophisticated and well-executed operations carried out by law enforcement in recent years. In the meantime, as the investigation into the stolen diamonds continued, the stolen goods began to surface in a variety of locations across the country. Some of the diamonds were found in pawn shops in Southern California, where they had been sold by low-level criminals who were unaware of their origins. Other pieces were recovered from an underground jewelry market in New York, where they had been sold to unknowing buyers. The extent of the operation was beginning to unfold, with more stolen items being recovered from various locations, including private buyers, black market dealers, and smuggling rings. One of the most pivotal moments in the investigation came when the FBI managed to trace a shipment of diamonds that had been sent overseas to Europe. The diamonds had been sold to a group of criminals who had ties to organized crime syndicates in the region. Through a series of coordinated efforts with European law enforcement, authorities were able to recover a significant portion of the stolen jewels that had been sold internationally. This international recovery was a major victory, as it not only demonstrated the reach of the criminals, but also highlighted the challenges of investigating transnational crime. As Victor, Lisa, James, and Gary sat in their respective holding cells, the investigators were putting together the final pieces of the puzzle. They were piecing together their extensive criminal backgrounds, following the trail of stolen goods, and identifying their contacts in the underground networks. The robbers' every move was being meticulously analyzed, from the moment they planned the heist to the way they laundered the stolen goods through various networks. The more the investigators dug, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated crime, but part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had operated for years, exploiting weak points in the security systems of luxury stores and jewelry businesses. The trial was drawing closer, and the pressure was mounting on the robbers. Their defense attorneys began scrambling to find ways to reduce their sentences, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had an ironclad case, with solid forensic evidence, recovered stolen goods, and testimonies from the robbers themselves. Some of the criminals, in an attempt to reduce their sentences, began to cooperate with the authorities, providing detailed accounts of the operation and naming their accomplices in the underground network. In the end, the investigation led to the dismantling of the entire criminal syndicate, with dozens of individuals arrested and charged with various crimes related to the theft, trafficking, and laundering of stolen goods. The case was considered a massive success for law enforcement, both locally and internationally, as it uncovered the far-reaching consequences of organized crime and its impact on global commerce. However, for those involved in the robbery, the real consequences were just beginning. The sentences handed down during the trial were harsh, and many of the criminals involved would spend decades behind bars. Victor, the mastermind, received the longest sentence, with a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lisa, James, and Gary each received lengthy sentences, ensuring that their involvement in the heist would follow them for the rest of their lives. The jewelry store, while eventually able to recover from the robbery, was left with scars that would never fully heal. The stolen goods were returned, and the store resumed its operations, but the traumatic experience of the robbery continued to haunt both the employees and the customers. Trust was something that couldn't be easily restored, and it would take years for the store to rebuild its reputation, and for the employees to overcome the psychological effects of the violent crime they had witnessed. The case stood as a testament to the complexities of modern-day crime, the level of planning and coordination required for such elaborate heists, and the relentless work of law enforcement to bring criminals to justice. It also served as a reminder of the powerful networks that exist within the criminal underworld, stretching far beyond what the public typically sees, and the constant need for vigilance in the face of such criminal enterprises. In the aftermath of the robbery, law enforcement continued to untangle the extensive web of connections that the robbers had maintained. Even though the primary criminals had been captured and their stolen goods largely recovered, the investigation into their broader network was far from over. Police and federal agents were working around the clock to track down the dealers, smugglers, and buyers who had been complicit in the theft and distribution of the jewels. It became clear that the operation had been far more sophisticated than initially thought. The ramifications of the heist were widespread, impacting not only the jewelry store and its employees, but also the city at large. As the investigation progressed, news outlets and social media began to feature more stories about the heist, giving the public a deeper understanding of the planning and execution that had gone into it. The heist had captured the imagination of many, as the robbers had managed to pull off such a bold crime without being caught for so long. Experts in criminal psychology weighed in on the minds of the thieves, offering insights into how they were able to stay under the radar despite the growing scrutiny. While the stolen jewelry was gradually being recovered from various underground markets, the law enforcement agencies were still working to uncover all of the stolen diamonds, watches, and other valuables. Through informants, wiretaps, and cooperation with international agencies, they managed to track down more of the stolen items. Several of these items had been sold to unwitting buyers, while others had been hidden in secret locations for future transactions. The detectives knew that each recovered item brought them closer to understanding the scale of the operation, but there was still so much to uncover. As the trial continued, the defense team of the robbers attempted to paint a picture of their clients as victims of circumstance, pressured into committing the crime by more dangerous figures. However, the evidence was overwhelming. There were records of phone calls, surveillance footage, and even financial transactions that tied the robbers directly to the heist. The prosecution's case was strong, and the public was eager for justice to be served. The robbers had underestimated the attention that their actions would attract, and were ultimately caught in a web of their own making. For the police officers involved in the case, the satisfaction of bringing the criminals to justice was tempered by the realization that this wasn't the last time such an operation would take place. While this particular case had been resolved, the larger issue of organized crime and high-profile heists remained. Detectives knew that other criminal syndicates were still out there, waiting for the right opportunity to exploit weaknesses in security and carry out their own heists. The robbers, sitting in courtrooms, awaited their sentencing. The emotional weight of the crime was evident on their faces as they sat before the judge, aware of the punishment that awaited them. Victor, who had been the mastermind, was given the harshest sentence, a life sentence without parole. Lisa, whose role in disabling the security system had been pivotal, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. James, the safecracker, received 15 years, and Gary, the low-level criminal who had attempted to sell the stolen ring, was given 10 years. As the sentences were handed down, the victims of the robbery, primarily the employees who had been held at gunpoint, found some semblance of closure. For them, the trial had been a long and painful journey. Many of the workers who had been present during the robbery had been affected psychologically, with some developing anxiety disorders and PTSD. The robbery had left an indelible mark on them, and the store provided counseling services to help the employees cope with the trauma. In the months following the trial, law enforcement continued to focus on dismantling the criminal network that had supported the robbery. Several more individuals were arrested, some for their role in selling the stolen goods, and others for their involvement in organizing similar heists. The case served as a warning to other criminals about the dangers of underestimating law enforcement's ability to bring them to justice. The intricate planning and execution of the heist had been met with an equally determined response from the authorities, proving that even the most elaborate crimes could be unraveled with patience and persistence. Meanwhile, the jewelry store slowly recovered from the traumatic experience. It had to rebuild its reputation, earn back the trust of its customers, and reassure them that its security systems had been upgraded to prevent future thefts. While some clients had lost confidence in the store's ability to safeguard their assets, others were willing to give the business another chance, especially after the store had worked to recover the stolen goods and cooperate fully with the investigation. The case also sparked changes in the way businesses approached security. Jewelry stores, luxury retailers, and other high-end establishments began investing heavily in state-of-the-art security technology, from biometric scanners to advanced surveillance systems that could detect the slightest movement or unusual activity. The robbery had served as a wake-up call for many in the retail industry, and a heightened sense of vigilance swept through businesses that dealt in valuable goods. Though the heist itself was over, the reverberations of the crime were still being felt across the city. The investigation had unearthed far-reaching criminal networks, and the robbery had become a case study for law enforcement agencies and criminologists. The story of how four seemingly unremarkable individuals had masterminded such a complex heist, and how law enforcement had been able to unravel the mystery, continued to captivate people's imaginations. For the robbers, the sentences handed down to them would mark the end of their criminal careers. Their names would forever be linked to one of the most notorious heists in Los Angeles history. But for those affected by the crime, the victims, the jewelry store employees, and the citizens of the city, the recovery process would take much longer. While the stolen jewels were returned, the emotional scars of the crime would linger, and the ripple effects would continue to be felt for years to come. The case, however, would stand as a testament to the dedication and persistence of law enforcement in bringing criminals to justice, no matter how sophisticated the crime. Story 5. In the year 2000, one of the most notorious and shocking criminal cases in the United States occurred when a series of high-profile carjackings were linked to a well-organized crime ring operating in the greater Los Angeles area. The series of crimes, which involved the violent hijacking of luxury vehicles, left the city on edge for several months, with authorities scrambling to uncover the identities of the criminals responsible. The first carjacking took place in the early months of 2000, when a wealthy businessman named Stephen Foster was ambushed outside his upscale Los Angeles home. Foster, a prominent real estate developer, had just returned from a dinner meeting when he was confronted by a masked gunman. The assailant, who appeared to be well-prepared and methodical, demanded the keys to Foster's brand-new Mercedes-Benz S-Class. After forcibly taking the vehicle, the gunman fled the scene, leaving the victim unharmed but shaken. Initially, the authorities suspected the incident was an isolated crime committed by a lone thief. But when similar carjackings began to occur with increasing frequency, it became clear that a much larger operation was at play. The criminals behind these heists were not only targeting luxury vehicles, but also using them as part of a wider scheme to launder money and move illegal goods across the state. The stolen cars, often equipped with high-end technology and valuable assets, were being sold on the black market or shipped overseas. The police force quickly mobilized, deploying a special task force dedicated to catching the criminals responsible. The task force, which included some of the best investigators from various law enforcement agencies, started to examine the similarities between each carjacking. A distinct pattern emerged. The criminals had been operating with a high level of coordination, and the vehicles they were targeting were not random. The cars, which were often worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, were typically taken in affluent neighborhoods, often near upscale shopping centers or wealthy residential areas. Detectives discovered that the crime ring was sophisticated and had a deep network of contacts who specialized in different areas of the operation. From the carjackers to the individuals who would receive and resell the stolen vehicles, each member of the group played a specific role. The carjackers themselves, who were typically masked and armed, would approach their victims in broad daylight. In some instances, the carjackers would wait for the driver to exit the vehicle and then force them into the passenger seat or take them at gunpoint, depending on the situation. Over time, the authorities began to uncover additional details about the syndicate. One of the key figures in the investigation was an individual named Carlos Big C. Hernandez, who was known for his connections to both the black market and organized crime in the Los Angeles area. Hernandez had a reputation for running a tight operation, and he seemed to have an extensive network of individuals who could help him distribute the stolen vehicles. As the investigation continued, detectives learned that Hernandez had been involved in several other illegal activities in addition to the carjackings. He was linked to money laundering schemes, drug trafficking, and even weapons smuggling. His criminal organization, known to insiders as the Syndicate, was known for its ability to infiltrate various sectors of the economy, particularly in high-end markets. The Syndicate's ability to coordinate such a complex operation, involving numerous players and locations, made it a formidable force in the underground world of crime. The task force worked tirelessly, attempting to track Hernandez's movements and uncover the full scope of his operation. They discovered that his reach extended far beyond Los Angeles, with connections in several other major cities, including San Francisco, Las Vegas, and even Miami. It appeared that Hernandez was running an international operation, orchestrating carjackings in one city, and then quickly moving the stolen vehicles to other locations to be sold. One breakthrough came when investigators were able to identify a pattern in the stolen vehicles. Many of the high-end cars, once stolen, were being resold through underground car auctions held in a series of warehouses and parking lots throughout the region. These events were covertly advertised through encrypted messages on dark web forums, attracting buyers willing to pay top dollar for stolen luxury cars. The vehicles were often modified to change their identifying marks, such as the VIN numbers, making them nearly impossible to trace. Detectives soon focused their attention on a particular group of individuals who had been seen attending these underground auctions. One of the key figures at these events was a man named Victor Alvarez, a known associate of Hernandez, who acted as a middleman between the carjackers and the buyers. Alvarez was well known in the underground scene for his ability to move stolen goods quickly and discreetly, often working with buyers overseas who sought to obtain luxury cars through illegal channels. The authorities continued to follow the money trail, tracking the financial transactions that were being used to fund the criminal enterprise. Bank records and wire transfers revealed that large sums of money were being moved across multiple countries. These funds were being funneled into various legitimate businesses that Hernandez and his associates owned, providing them with the cover they needed to launder the money and sustain their criminal activities. As the investigation progressed, the task force began to close in on Hernandez and his criminal network. After months of surveillance and intelligence gathering, they were able to identify the location of one of the largest car auctions being held in a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles. With this information, they coordinated a massive raid on the facility, hoping to capture both the vehicles and those responsible for selling them. On the night of the raid, a team of agents stormed the warehouse, securing several dozen stolen luxury cars that were about to be sold to buyers from across the globe. The operation was a success, and multiple arrests were made, including that of Victor Alvarez. However, Hernandez himself remained elusive. Despite the authorities' best efforts, he had managed to evade capture, at least for the time being. The investigation into the carjacking ring continued for several more months, with authorities piecing together more details of Hernandez's operation. As the task force closed in on the final players in the scheme, they uncovered new leads, including a hidden stash of weapons and drugs that were part of the syndicate's illegal trade. Despite the continued success of the investigation, Hernandez's whereabouts remained unknown, and law enforcement continued their search for the mastermind behind the operation. Meanwhile, the victims of the carjackings, many of whom had been targeted while in the comfort of their own homes, struggled with the psychological toll of the crimes. While the stolen vehicles were being returned to their rightful owners, the emotional trauma of the violent encounters was far more difficult to recover from. Victims spoke out about their experiences, shedding light on the fear and helplessness they had felt during the attacks. Many had to undergo therapy and counseling to cope with the anxiety and trauma. The case gained national attention, not only because of the high-profile nature of the heists, but also because it exposed the dark world of organized crime operating under the surface of seemingly mundane transactions. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting the sophistication of the operation and the ingenuity with which the criminals had carried out their crimes. The investigation became one of the largest and most complex of its kind, drawing attention to the ways in which criminals could exploit modern technology and global networks to perpetuate their illegal activities. As the case eventually went to trial, the authorities were able to charge several members of the criminal ring, including Alvarez and others who had been caught during the raids. Hernandez, however, remained at large, and the case became a national symbol of the ongoing battle between law enforcement and organized crime syndicates. In the months following the raid on the warehouse, the investigation into the carjacking syndicate continued with mounting urgency. The authorities now knew that they were dealing with a highly organized and ruthless group of criminals whose activities spanned several states and involved a complex network of individuals. The task force was determined to capture the remaining criminals, including Carlos Big C. Hernandez, the mastermind behind the operation, who had managed to elude capture despite the heavy surveillance and resources that had been dedicated to tracking him. The stolen vehicles were a significant part of the criminal operation, but they were not the only illicit activity the group had been involved in. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Hernandez and his associates had been using the stolen cars as a means to transport and distribute illegal goods, including drugs and firearms. The criminals had established an underground network of warehouses, safe houses, and transport routes that allowed them to move stolen vehicles, drugs, and weapons with alarming efficiency. The stolen cars were often driven across state lines to be resold in cities like Las Vegas, Miami, and even New York. But in addition to the vehicles, investigators found that the criminals had been using the same routes to smuggle drugs, including cocaine and methamphetamine, into various parts of the country. The cars would be modified to hide the illegal substances in secret compartments, making it difficult for law enforcement to detect. The money earned from these transactions was then funneled through a series of legitimate businesses owned by Hernandez and his associates, creating a complex web of money laundering. The authorities were also able to track the movement of large sums of money across multiple countries. Wire transfers, often routed through offshore accounts, pointed to a network of international buyers who were purchasing the stolen luxury cars and other goods. These buyers, many of whom were based in Europe and Asia, were willing to pay a premium for the vehicles, knowing that they could easily be resold without detection. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement began to focus on these international connections, knowing that capturing the criminals involved in the global network would require cooperation from agencies around the world. In an effort to uncover more about the syndicate's operations, law enforcement began to rely on informants. Some members of the criminal ring had already been arrested and were cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. These informants, many of whom had been low-level criminals with limited involvement in the carjackings, provided crucial intelligence that helped the authorities build a clearer picture of the syndicate's inner workings. One informant, a former associate of Hernandez's named Jesse, was particularly valuable. Jesse had worked as a driver for the syndicate, transporting stolen vehicles from one location to another, but had been arrested during one of the carjacking operations. While in custody, he became more willing to cooperate with authorities, offering insights into the way the criminals operated. He described how Hernandez had recruited members of the syndicate, often targeting individuals with backgrounds in street-level crime or those who had experience with high-end vehicles. Hernandez, Jesse explained, had an uncanny ability to identify people who could be useful to the operation, and he maintained strict control over the distribution of tasks within the group. Jesse also revealed that Hernandez was known for his meticulous planning. According to Jesse, the carjackings were not random. They were carefully coordinated with specific vehicles in mind. The group had a list of luxury cars, including high-end sports cars, luxury sedans, and expensive SUVs, that they targeted for the heists. Hernandez had a network of informants who kept tabs on wealthy individuals and knew when they were likely to drive certain cars, allowing the thieves to strike at the most opportune times. The carjackings themselves were usually quick and efficient. The robbers would approach their victims in parking lots or near their homes, often in broad daylight, and demand the keys to the vehicles. In some cases, they would threaten the victims with firearms or even violence to ensure compliance. The criminals had little regard for the safety of their victims and were known to have used force when necessary. The fear and trauma inflicted on the victims were profound, but the thieves rarely left any witnesses behind to identify them, and the stolen vehicles would disappear into the black market before anyone had a chance to react. As the informants provided more information, law enforcement began to piece together the timeline of the criminal operation. The task force learned that Hernandez had been running the syndicate for several years, but it wasn't until the year 2000 that his activities had escalated to the point of the high-profile carjackings. During this time, the carjackings had become more brazen, with criminals targeting high-value cars in highly visible locations. The increasing frequency and sophistication of the crimes caught the attention of both local law enforcement and the media, making it difficult for Hernandez to keep his operation under wraps. While the authorities continued to pursue the criminals at the lower levels of the operation, the focus remained on Hernandez, who was believed to be hiding somewhere in the United States. Despite the heat surrounding him, Hernandez remained elusive, careful to cover his tracks and avoid detection. He had gone to great lengths to change his appearance, often using false identities and traveling with fake documents to throw off the authorities. The task force knew that catching him would require patience, precision, and a coordinated effort across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation into the larger network continued, as more arrests were made and more stolen vehicles were recovered. The authorities also managed to track down several of Hernandez's associates, who had helped facilitate the sale of the cars and other goods. These individuals were interrogated, and like Jesse, many eventually provided valuable information that allowed law enforcement to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. The stolen vehicles were gradually recovered from various locations, including underground warehouses, secure parking garages, and shipping containers. As the months passed, the pressure on Hernandez intensified. With every arrest, the walls were closing in on him. The task force was closing in on his operations, and Hernandez knew it was only a matter of time before he was caught. However, he remained a step ahead, continuing to move through a complex web of safe houses and contacts, always staying just out of reach of the law. The criminal organization that had once seemed invincible was beginning to unravel, but Hernandez's ability to remain hidden was a constant source of frustration for law enforcement. The investigation had taken on a new urgency. Now that the authorities were aware of the full extent of the syndicate's operations, they knew that dismantling it completely was essential to preventing further criminal activity. Hernandez's capture was the key to ending the reign of terror that had been inflicted on the citizens of Los Angeles and beyond. Every day that passed without his capture meant that more vehicles, drugs, and money were being moved, and the crime ring's influence continued to spread. The authorities knew they had to act quickly to stop Hernandez before his operation could expand even further. As the investigation into Carlos Hernandez's criminal operation continued to unfold, the urgency to locate and apprehend him only increased. The task force, now working under intense pressure, began to narrow down Hernandez's potential locations. Intelligence gathered from informants, surveillance footage, and wiretaps suggested that he was moving between various hideouts in different parts of the country, often using aliases and fake documents to stay under the radar. Despite these efforts, Hernandez's ability to stay hidden seemed nearly uncanny. He was constantly shifting his locations, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to track him. In early 2001, after several months of following leads and piecing together fragmented intelligence, investigators received a tip that Hernandez had been spotted in Miami. This was a significant breakthrough, as it marked the first time law enforcement had concrete information about his whereabouts in months. A stakeout was set up around the area where Hernandez was believed to be staying, and undercover officers were deployed to monitor his activities. The task force believed that they had finally cornered Hernandez, and they knew that this operation had to be meticulously planned. Hernandez was not only the mastermind behind the carjackings, but had also proven himself to be highly dangerous, given the violent nature of his crimes and his ability to avoid capture for so long. The authorities were prepared for the possibility that he might resist arrest, and were ready to take the necessary steps to bring him in. In the days that followed, the task force intensified their surveillance, monitoring Hernandez's every move. The operation was kept tightly under wraps to prevent any tip-offs to the suspect. Hernandez had a reputation for being cautious, and his ability to maintain multiple layers of concealment made him a formidable adversary. However, the authorities had learned from past mistakes and were determined not to let him slip through their fingers again. On the morning of March 22, 2001, the breakthrough came. Hernandez was seen leaving a safe house in downtown Miami, boarding a vehicle that appeared to be a high-end luxury sedan, one of the same models he had stolen during his carjacking spree. The officers, who had been closely monitoring his movements for weeks, quickly alerted the rest of the team. The operation was set in motion. A tactical team, including SWAT officers and specialized units, was mobilized to intercept the vehicle before it could leave the city. The plan was to execute a controlled takedown, ensuring that Hernandez would be apprehended without any collateral damage or loss of life. They tracked his vehicle through the streets of Miami, maintaining a safe distance so as not to alert him. Hernandez, unaware that the authorities were closing in, seemed to be going about his business, as if he were a regular citizen. For several tense minutes, Hernandez's car weaved through the busy streets of Miami, unknowingly heading straight into a police blockade that had been set up in a nearby alley. The officers positioned their vehicles strategically, cutting off any escape routes. It was a carefully choreographed maneuver designed to leave Hernandez with no way out. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the takedown was executed. The police vehicles swiftly closed in on Hernandez's car, surrounding it on all sides. Hernandez, realizing that he had been trapped, attempted to make a run for it. But before he could open the door, officers were already at the vehicle, forcing him to the ground and handcuffing him in one swift motion. It was over. The long manhunt that had stretched across months and involved countless hours of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and coordination had finally culminated in the capture of Carlos Hernandez. The arrest was a major victory for law enforcement, but it was just the beginning of the legal process. Hernandez was taken into custody and transferred to a high-security facility, where he would await trial for his role in the carjacking syndicate. The authorities wasted no time in charging him with multiple counts of carjacking, conspiracy, money laundering, weapons trafficking, and drug smuggling. The charges alone were enough to ensure that Hernandez would face a lengthy prison sentence if convicted. In the days following his arrest, more details about Hernandez's operation emerged. Investigators were able to recover additional stolen vehicles, many of which had been transported to other states or sold overseas. Hernandez's network was far-reaching, and his influence within the criminal underworld had allowed him to evade justice for so long. The authorities now had a clearer picture of the syndicate's activities, and they began to take steps to dismantle the remaining members of the operation. As the trial began, the media coverage of the case intensified. The story of the manhunt, the sophisticated criminal network, and the eventual capture of the mastermind behind it all captivated the public's attention. Hernandez's arrest was seen as a major victory for law enforcement, especially given the scale and complexity of the operation. It was a testament to the determination and resourcefulness of the task force that had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. But as the trial proceeded, it became clear that Hernandez was not going to go down without a fight. His defense team, well-funded and highly skilled, began to mount a vigorous defense on his behalf. They argued that Hernandez had been unfairly targeted and that many of the charges against him were based on circumstantial evidence. They painted him as a victim of overzealous law enforcement and insisted that there was no direct evidence linking him to the carjackings themselves. Despite the defense's efforts, the prosecution presented a strong case. They relied on the testimony of several key witnesses, including former associates of Hernandez, who had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. These individuals provided crucial details about the inner workings of the criminal organization, detailing how Hernandez had coordinated the carjackings and distributed the stolen vehicles. The prosecution also presented forensic evidence, including fingerprints and DNA found on the stolen cars, that directly linked Hernandez to the crimes. In addition, the prosecution highlighted the significant financial gain Hernandez had made from the operation. They showed how the money earned from the carjackings, drug smuggling, and weapons trafficking had been funneled through a series of shell companies and hidden bank accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury began to deliberate on the charges. The trial lasted several months, with both sides presenting their cases in a dramatic courtroom battle. In the end, Hernandez was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal operations in the United States at the time. The authorities had successfully dismantled a complex and dangerous network that had terrorized the city of Los Angeles and beyond. For the victims, the conviction brought a sense of closure, though the emotional scars of the carjackings would take much longer to heal. Many of them had been left traumatized by the violent encounters, and the thought of losing their prized possessions in such a way had left lasting marks on their psyches. But with Hernandez behind bars, there was a sense of justice. The streets of Los Angeles, once filled with fear and uncertainty, were a little safer once more. In the months following Carlos Hernandez's conviction, the authorities continued to track down and arrest other members of his syndicate. With the dismantling of the operation, investigators learned more about the inner workings of the criminal network and how far-reaching it had been. Hernandez's arrest had put a significant dent in the syndicate, but it became evident that his network was not the only one of its kind. The authorities' success in taking down the operation had ripple effects, leading to the uncovering of similar groups in different states. Law enforcement agencies began to recognize that organized crime, especially in the form of carjackings, was a growing problem that required a more coordinated national response. Though the criminal underworld was always shifting, the case against Hernandez served as a major turning point. It showcased the power of collaboration between local, state, and federal agencies, and the resources that could be mobilized when the need arose. The task force's success was largely due to the hard work and commitment of investigators who refused to back down, even when the pursuit seemed endless. They knew that every stolen car recovered, every person brought to justice, and every piece of evidence that was uncovered mattered. For the families and victims affected by Hernandez's carjackings, the sense of relief was palpable. Many had been left feeling violated, not just by the theft of their vehicles, but by the violent nature of the crimes. The fear they had felt every day, wondering if they would be the next target, was slowly replaced by a sense of justice. For some, the emotional scars of the events would remain for years, but knowing that the mastermind was behind bars offered a measure of comfort. In the aftermath of the trial, several other members of the carjacking syndicate who had been caught in the investigation were also convicted. Some cooperated with authorities and received reduced sentences, while others were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The full scope of the operation became increasingly clear, with many of the lower-level criminals admitting their roles in the heists. Some were drivers, others acted as lookouts, and a few handled the resale of the stolen vehicles. But all of them had been complicit in the syndicate's crimes. The dismantling of the operation was hailed as a major victory, but it also served as a reminder of the persistence of organized crime and the challenges faced by law enforcement in combating such networks. In the months that followed Hernandez's conviction, the case continued to make headlines. Documentaries were made, books were written, and news outlets covered the trial extensively. Public fascination with the case stemmed from the scale of the operation and the high-profile nature of the crimes, which had impacted the lives of many victims. Hernandez's life story, his rise from small-time criminal to the leader of a nationwide carjacking syndicate, fascinated the public. He was portrayed as a mastermind who had evaded capture for years, manipulating others to do his bidding while remaining out of the reach of law enforcement. In the years that followed, law enforcement agencies across the country took lessons from the Hernandez case. The task force, which had been formed specifically to target his syndicate, became a model for similar operations in other parts of the United States. The case highlighted the need for improved surveillance technologies, better interagency communication, and the importance of going after the larger criminal organizations that often operated in the shadows. The authorities were acutely aware that dismantling such organizations required a comprehensive approach, one that included everything from intelligence gathering to the use of informants, to tactical raids and high-level arrests. At the same time, the case also led to changes in the way stolen vehicles were tracked. The use of GPS technology in cars, while still in its infancy at the time of Hernandez's operation, would eventually become a key tool for law enforcement in combating vehicle thefts. More states began to implement systems that allowed stolen cars to be tracked and recovered more efficiently, making it harder for criminals like Hernandez to operate. The carjackings, once seen as a high-risk, low-reward crime, were no longer as lucrative for criminals, thanks in part to the rise in security technology. Hernandez's own life behind bars was marked by a sense of isolation. Though he had once been the leader of a powerful and far-reaching criminal enterprise, he was now confined to a maximum security prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His days were spent in solitary confinement, reflecting on the choices that had led him to a life of crime. But even in prison, he maintained the air of confidence that had allowed him to manipulate others so successfully. He became known among the prison population for his ability to strategize and maintain control over those around him, despite his circumstances. Yet, even in his new environment, Hernandez faced challenges. The very people who had once admired and feared him now saw him as just another inmate, and his status as a powerful figure in the criminal world quickly faded. Meanwhile, some of the other members of his syndicate, the ones who had been caught and cooperated with law enforcement, began to serve out their sentences. While many had expressed remorse for their roles in the crimes, they faced the difficult reality of life in prison, with little chance of early release. The impact of the carjackings lingered in the communities where the crimes had taken place. For those who had been victims of the syndicate, the recovery of their stolen vehicles and the conviction of the criminals involved was a bittersweet victory. Over the next few years, as Hernandez remained behind bars, law enforcement continued to uncover the full extent of the syndicate's operations. The authorities, while focused on Hernandez's case, continued to combat car thefts and other forms of organized crime, using the lessons learned from the investigation to refine their tactics. The fight against crime never ceased, and the efforts of those involved in the Hernandez case would go on to inspire future investigations. For the public, the story of Carlos Hernandez and his carjacking syndicate became a reminder of the ongoing battle between law enforcement and organized crime, and the resilience of those who fought to make their communities safer. The capture of Hernandez, though it marked the end of one criminal network, underscored the continuing need for vigilance, cooperation, and perseverance in the face of ever-evolving threats. And as the years passed, Hernandez's name became synonymous with one of the most successful takedowns in the fight against organized crime, ensuring that the impact of his conviction would be felt for years to come. Story 6. In the early morning hours of January 1st, 2002, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Rolling Acres, a tragic crime would unfold that would leave the community in shock and disbelief. The small, peaceful town, which had been accustomed to the sound of children playing in the streets and neighbors chatting on their porches, was suddenly thrown into the harsh light of a criminal investigation. It all began with a phone call at 5:30 a.m. The police dispatch received a report of a disturbance at the home of Carla and Mark Thornton, a couple who had been married for over 15 years. The dispatcher noted the urgency in the voice of the caller, who described hearing loud noises and then an abrupt silence. The dispatcher immediately sent a patrol car to the scene. By the time the officers arrived, they found the front door ajar. Inside, the house appeared untouched, with no signs of forced entry. It was a typical middle-class home, a two-story structure with a neat front lawn and a driveway that led to a two-car garage. However, the tranquility of the exterior masked the horror that awaited them inside. Carla Thornton, 40, was found lying motionless on the living room floor. The officers rushed to check for a pulse, but it was clear she had been murdered. Her husband, Mark, was nowhere to be found. The only sign of life was a faint trace of blood leading upstairs. The officers cautiously followed the trail, their hearts pounding as they reached the master bedroom. In the bedroom, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Mark Thornton, 42, was lying on the bed unconscious, with what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds. He was immediately rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save his life. But the question on everyone's mind was, what had happened here? Was this a botched murder-suicide attempt, or was there something more sinister at play? Detectives began their investigation by examining the crime scene. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing seemed to have been stolen. Carla's body showed no signs of trauma, but it was clear that she had been murdered. Her injuries were peculiar, no visible wounds, but her body showed signs of suffocation. The forensic team soon confirmed that Carla had died from asphyxiation. The case was not a typical domestic dispute gone wrong. There were far too many unanswered questions. Why had Mark attempted to end his own life? Was he the perpetrator, or had someone else been involved? What could have triggered such an event in a seemingly stable household? As the day wore on, the detectives interviewed neighbors, family members, and friends. The Thornton family had always been known as friendly and well-liked members of the community. No one had ever suspected any trouble. Mark was a successful business executive, and Carla was a well-respected member of the local charity organization. The couple had 2 children, a teenage son and a young daughter, both of whom had spent the night at a relative's house during the incident. The investigation deepened, and the more the authorities looked into the couple's lives, the more they realized that there were hidden fractures beneath the surface of their perfect exterior. But those details would not come to light until later. By the end of the first day, Mark Thornton had regained consciousness, though he remained in critical condition. He was unable to speak due to the damage caused by his self-inflicted injuries, but detectives were eager to speak with him. They needed answers. The day after the crime, the investigation was in full swing. Detectives combed through the Thornton household, looking for any evidence that could explain what had transpired between the couple in the hours before Carla's tragic death. At first glance, the scene seemed almost too ordinary, as if nothing could have gone awry in this quiet home. But the details began to slowly unravel as the investigators took a closer look. Carla's body, still lying in the living room, had been carefully examined by forensic experts. The initial report confirmed what they had suspected. She had been asphyxiated, most likely with a pillow or some soft object that could have blocked her airways. There was no sign of struggle, no bruising or defensive wounds. Her eyes were wide open, a reflection of the terror she must have felt in her final moments. She had been suffocated, but it didn't seem like a violent act of rage. The absence of obvious trauma indicated a carefully planned and executed killing. Meanwhile, Mark Thornton, in the hospital, was fighting for his life. The officers who had initially found him unconscious in the bedroom were perplexed. His wounds were self-inflicted, but the method was strange. Mark had slashed his wrists with surgical precision, and the blood loss was severe enough to put him in critical condition. Yet there were no signs of suicidal intent in the days leading up to the incident. Those closest to him reported that he had appeared calm, even content. The absence of depression or any outward signs of mental distress only deepened the mystery. The police quickly began to piece together a timeline of the events leading up to that fateful morning. Carla and Mark had attended a New Year's Eve party the night before, hosted by close family friends. According to guests at the party, the couple seemed happy, engaged in conversation, and didn't show any signs of trouble. There were no arguments, no signs of tension. In fact, the couple left early, around 1 a.m., both claiming they were tired after a long year. The Thornton family, according to those who saw them, had seemed normal, even idyllic. But as detectives dug deeper, small inconsistencies began to surface. Friends and family began mentioning strange details. Carla had recently started to withdraw from her social circles. She had stopped attending charity meetings and had begun spending more time alone. Mark, too, had become increasingly distant, missing work for long periods of time, though he didn't seem ill. One of Mark's co-workers, a man named David Ross, was particularly concerned. David told detectives that, in the months leading up to the incident, Mark had been acting increasingly withdrawn. He had missed several important meetings and had even seemed disoriented at times. His performance at work had taken a noticeable decline, but he never seemed to offer any explanation. When David asked him about it, Mark brushed it off, claiming that the pressure of work was getting to him. Despite these subtle signs, no one suspected anything major was wrong. Mark had always been the type to keep his personal issues private. Carla had been the social glue, the one who organized events, and it was difficult for anyone to believe that she might be in any kind of danger. But the truth, as detectives would soon discover, was far more complicated. As the investigation continued, a breakthrough came when the police were able to access Mark's cell phone records. They discovered that in the weeks leading up to the incident, Mark had been in regular contact with someone, but not his wife. Instead, he had exchanged dozens of messages with Clara Williams, a woman from his past. Clara had been a colleague of Mark's at his first job after college. They had shared a brief, passionate romance, but it ended when Mark married Carla. The texts between Mark and Clara revealed an affair that had been going on for months. At first, the messages were flirtatious, and then they became more intimate. Clara, it seemed, had rekindled a spark with Mark, and their conversations became a significant part of his emotional life. But there was more to it. Clara had begun to demand more of Mark's time and attention. She wanted him to leave Carla, and the pressure seemed to be mounting. In one of their last conversations, Clara texted, "You don't need her anymore. I'm all you need. Don't let her keep you in that cage." What the detectives didn't know at the time was how deeply this affair had affected Mark. It was clear that he was struggling to reconcile his feelings for both women. In his messages with Clara, there were indications of guilt, but also a sense of entrapment. Mark had not ended the affair, but he also hadn't fully committed to Clara. This ambiguity seemed to create a dangerous emotional turmoil, one that left him conflicted about his marriage and the future. At this point, detectives had to ask themselves, had this affair played a role in Carla's murder? Was the stress of being caught in a love triangle so overwhelming that Mark had snapped? Or had Clara, frustrated with Mark's inability to make a decision, played a more sinister role in the death of Carla Thornton? There were also questions about the timing. Why had Mark attempted to kill himself after Carla's death? Had the guilt of the murder overwhelmed him, or was his self-inflicted violence part of a calculated plan? Was it an effort to escape the consequences of his actions, or part of a larger cover-up? The police were determined to find out. The investigation had already shifted from a simple domestic violence case to something much darker. And with each new piece of evidence that emerged, it became clear that this was no ordinary murder. As detectives waited for Mark to regain full consciousness, they knew that the next few days would be crucial. Whatever answers Mark had, they would need to come soon, before the case became even more tangled in its complexities. As the days passed, Mark Thornton's condition slowly improved, but the detectives' patience was wearing thin. They had more questions than answers, and the clock was ticking. The media had caught wind of the case, and the small town of Rolling Acres was soon the focus of national attention. Everyone wanted to know why a respected, seemingly well-adjusted couple had come to such a violent and tragic end. The mystery surrounding Carla's death and Mark's attempted suicide grew more perplexing with each passing day. Mark remained unconscious for nearly 2 full days, leaving investigators with no choice but to continue following the trail of evidence they had gathered. As the medical staff continued to monitor his recovery, the detectives expanded their search. They delved deeper into the lives of both Carla and Mark, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could explain the events of that fateful night. The phone records, the messages with Clara Williams, and the strained relationship between Mark and his wife painted a picture of a man caught in a web of emotional turmoil. But there was still something missing, a motive, a definitive reason why Mark would resort to murder. The detectives knew that the key to solving this case lay within the man who was still recovering in the hospital, clinging to life. It was not until January 4th, 3 days after the incident, that Mark Thornton finally regained consciousness. His hospital room was guarded by 2 officers, and when he opened his eyes, he was met with their cold stares. Mark's first words were weak, almost inaudible, but they were enough to confirm one chilling fact. He remembered nothing. He had no recollection of what had transpired the night of Carla's death, nor of his own self-inflicted wounds. The detectives were frustrated. They had hoped that Mark's memory would offer some clarity, but his inability to recall any details left them with more questions. Despite this, they were determined to make progress. The hospital room was soon filled with officers, medical personnel, and investigators, all trying to make sense of the situation. Mark was told about his wife's death and his own near-fatal injuries, but his reaction was one of shock and confusion. He had no recollection of his wife's final moments. He had no memory of the argument, the violent struggle, or the suffocation that had taken place in the living room. But what was most unsettling was his apparent lack of grief. When he was told that Carla had died, Mark didn't break down in tears, nor did he express any significant emotion. He simply stared blankly at the detective in front of him, as if trying to process the information, but unable to feel anything. Mark was asked about the affair with Clara Williams, and his response was an emotional one, though it seemed more like an attempt to dodge the question rather than a genuine reflection. He denied that the affair had any connection to his wife's death. He claimed that he had been trying to end things with Clara for months, that the relationship had become toxic and strained. But the evidence spoke differently. Clara's text messages and phone records revealed that she had been pressing Mark to leave Carla, and she had even hinted at drastic measures if he didn't. The detectives grew increasingly suspicious of Mark's involvement, but they knew they needed more than just a confession. They needed hard evidence that could link him to Carla's death. It was at this point that they turned to the forensic analysis of the crime scene, hoping that the smallest detail could provide them with the missing piece. Back at the Thornton residence, forensic specialists had been meticulously collecting evidence. They found that the pillow found near Carla's body had no traces of DNA that could identify it as the murder weapon. However, they did discover something odd, a small, inconspicuous scrap of paper that had been wedged beneath the couch. The paper, when examined, contained a series of cryptic scribbles, almost like a note, though it was hastily written and appeared to be incomplete. It read, "I can't do it anymore. She's too much. I just wanted to be with you." The handwriting was confirmed to be Mark's. This discovery sent a jolt through the investigation. The note appeared to be a confession of sorts, but it was unclear whether it was a plea for help or a final message before the murder. The detectives immediately questioned whether it was written before or after Carla's death. Was it written in a moment of desperation, in an attempt to justify the crime to himself? Or was it a product of the pressure Mark had felt from Clara to make a choice? The note seemed to suggest both guilt and a twisted sense of relief, a deep desire to escape the life he had with Carla and the pressure of his affair. The detectives were now certain that Mark had played a key role in Carla's death. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were still unsure whether he had acted alone or if Clara Williams had been involved in some way. Clara's insistence that Mark leave his wife was clear, but it was equally clear that she had not been at the scene of the crime. Could she have orchestrated the murder from afar? Or was Mark acting entirely on his own, driven by the weight of his actions and the turmoil within his marriage? While the detectives worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, Mark's emotional state remained unstable. He had become more withdrawn, refusing to speak much during questioning. His guilt seemed to hang over him like a heavy cloud. His physical recovery was slow, but the emotional scars were even more profound. He refused to look anyone in the eye, his gaze often fixed on some far-off point in the room, as if he were reliving the events in his mind. It was clear that he was struggling with something deep inside, but he remained silent. As the days passed, the police had to make a decision. Mark had now been hospitalized for nearly a week, and the investigation was at a standstill. The evidence they had gathered pointed to him as the prime suspect, but they still needed a confession, and without one, they could not make an arrest. It seemed as if the case was teetering on the edge of closure, but they were not yet finished. The following week was one of intense uncertainty. The small town of Rolling Acres, which had once known nothing but peace and serenity, was now filled with whispers. Neighbors exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to process the unraveling details of the Thornton case. The authorities knew they had a difficult road ahead, not just in solving the crime, but in managing the emotional weight it carried for the community. But for the detectives, there was no time to consider public opinion. They had a duty to get to the truth. Mark Thornton had become a shell of the man he had once been. His physical recovery was slow but steady, and each day that passed seemed to weigh more heavily on him. His memory remained a blank, and his inability to recall the events that led to Carla's death made it all the more difficult for investigators to piece the puzzle together. He would not speak about the affair, nor would he comment on the cryptic note found at the scene of the crime. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Mark had not confessed, and without a confession, they could not proceed with an arrest. The police took their next steps cautiously. The forensic team returned to the Thornton home, searching for any overlooked clues that might tie Mark to the crime in a more definitive way. Their efforts seemed futile at first, but a breakthrough came when they discovered something unexpected in the attic. There, hidden beneath old furniture and dusty boxes, they found a journal belonging to Carla. The journal had been kept secret, tucked away from prying eyes. It wasn't clear why Carla had chosen to document her thoughts in private, but it was now an invaluable resource. The journal revealed something startling. Carla had suspected something was wrong in her marriage long before the tragic events of January 1st. She wrote of feeling increasingly isolated from Mark, of sensing that he was pulling away from her, emotionally and physically. But the entries didn't point solely to Mark's affair with Clara. Carla had written about strange behavior from Mark, things that seemed uncharacteristic. She had even made vague references to his mood swings, his sudden irritability, and the odd feeling that something was simmering beneath the surface. What struck the detectives as most troubling was an entry from December 20th, 2 weeks before her death. It read, "I think he's hiding something from me. I'm scared of what he might do if I confront him." This entry didn't necessarily provide new information, but it added to the growing understanding of the dynamics within the Thornton marriage. Carla had been scared, but she hadn't known the extent of the danger she was facing. She had been slowly piecing together the fractured parts of her marriage, but in the end, it seemed she never had a chance to confront the truth. Armed with this newfound knowledge, the detectives pressed forward. They began to focus more intently on the timeline of events leading up to the murder. There was one final piece of the puzzle that had yet to be fully explored: Mark's interactions with Clara Williams in the days leading up to Carla's death. The affair, although painful, had not been the driving force behind the murder, but it was clear now that Clara's role was more complex than they had first thought. She had pushed Mark into a corner, pressuring him to leave Carla, to make a decision, to free himself from the marriage. Clara had continued to text Mark even after the incident, trying to manipulate him emotionally, telling him that Carla's death was for the best, that they could now be together. These messages, once dismissed as mere desperation, were now seen in a darker light. Detectives made a crucial decision. They needed to bring Clara in for questioning. They couldn't ignore the possibility that her influence had played a role in Carla's death. Even though Clara had not been physically present during the murder, her manipulation of Mark could have been the spark that ignited the tragedy. When Clara was interviewed, she maintained her composure at first. She expressed shock and sorrow at Carla's death, but also a strange sense of detachment. She didn't cry. She didn't seem truly distressed. She spoke of how much she had cared for Mark, how she had been trying to help him get out of a marriage that had been suffocating him. She denied any involvement in Carla's death, claiming she had not known the events would escalate the way they did. But when questioned about the messages she had sent to Mark after the murder, Clara became defensive. She admitted to urging Mark to move on with her, but she denied any culpability in Carla's death. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Clara said, her voice cold and distant. "I just wanted him to be happy." The detectives, now armed with a clearer picture, were left with a disturbing conclusion. Mark Thornton, under the pressure of his own guilt and the manipulative force of his affair with Clara, had cracked. He had made the choice to end his marriage, but in doing so, he had taken the life of his wife. Clara, while not physically involved in the murder, had been an accomplice in the emotional sense. She had driven Mark to the brink, using her own manipulative tactics to push him to make a final, irreversible decision. Mark was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Carla Thornton. The prosecution argued that while Clara had not directly participated in the murder, her actions had been a significant factor in the emotional turmoil Mark experienced. Clara Williams, while never charged with involvement in the crime, was left to face the aftermath of her own manipulation. The case sent shockwaves through Rolling Acres, a town that would never be the same again. As the trial began, the truth of the Thornton tragedy became painfully clear. Mark's guilt was undeniable, and the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Clara, though never charged with the crime, was left to grapple with her own role in the tragedy. She had gotten what she wanted in the end. Mark was free of Carla, but at what cost? The case of Carla Thornton's murder would forever be etched in the memories of those who knew her, a reminder of the deep and sometimes dangerous consequences of manipulation, betrayal, and unchecked emotional pressure. And as for Mark Thornton, his fate was sealed, not by his own hands, but by the twisted web of choices he had made.